Yo, what's going on YouTube? How you guys doing? This video is going to be a tier list video. I decided, you know what? Why don't I just do more tier list videos? You know, they're kind of easy to do, they're kind of chill, and I can just kind of spread my knowledge. Well, my knowledge or maybe just like my opinions, I guess. I don't know. Is it really knowledge? I'm just gonna give my opinions. You know what I mean? And people might disagree with them, or maybe you agree with them. I don't know. But I'm gonna give my thoughts on things. And this is a perk tier list, but if you notice, we don't have every perk here. These are only killer perks, and these are only tracking perks. So this is a tracking perk tier list. And the way this tier list is going to work is I'm going to judge the perks based off specifically their tracking. So for example, if a perk does multiple things, and one of them happens to be tracking, I am not really going to judge it based on the other thing. I'm just going to be rating it on the tracking. So a good example of this would be like Scourge Hook, right? Like the new Scourge Hook Pain Resonance. This kind of gives tracking as well as slowdown, but I'm only judging it for the tracking, okay? When I'm actually talking about the perk, I will talk about how good I think it is in general, but this is just for tracking, and then we'll, obviously if it has another effect too, I'll put it on another tier list somewhere as well, because I'm going to be doing other ones. We're going to be doing this one, which is the tracking tier list. We're also going to be doing a lethality tier list. We're going to be doing a slowdown tier list, and then also a utility tier list. So this is 1 out of 4, and we're going to go through it, and we're going to put all these perks in some sort of a tier. Also, if you haven't caught based off what I said, not every single one of these perks is like a guaranteed necessarily tracking perk. Some of them like some of these perks, their primary function is something other than tracking, but they have some tracking on the side, and I'm still gonna base it, or I'm still gonna try to tier it as best I can, even given the circumstances. And honestly, I might add another tier to this. You know what? I think I might do it even with this first perk. The very first perk on this list is Blood Warden, and I might do it with this perk because Blood Warden is a perfect example of a perk that primarily does not get used for tracking. As a matter of fact, I think a lot of people might not even know what tracking I'm talking about when it comes to this perk. But when you have Blood Warden, any survivors that are in the exit gates, you can see their auras. So if survivors are kind of just like sitting in the exit gates waiting, you can see that it's a killer. You can see their aura. But that is not really the primary function of this. Like, I don't think anyone is really choosing to run Blood Warden specifically for that function. So I'm actually going to add a new tier. Hold on. Okay, I added an honorary mention, and that's where that one's going. So any perk that has like a very... Okay. Any perk that has like a very minor effect as far as tracking goes, to the point where like it's essentially not even relevant at all, is going to go into honorary mention. Okay, and if you're like Tofu, why even include it in the tier list at all? Well, you want to know why? It's because when I first split these perks into a bunch of categories, I did it on stream. I did it live on stream, and I wanted to get other people's opinions so that I didn't maybe put something in the wrong category or whatever. And my Twitch chat was very, very strict that they wanted Blood Warden to be in this category, and same thing with a lot of these other perks that like barely do tracking, right? I was putting them in the categories, and they were like, well, Tofu, technically it's tracking because of this, and that. So you know what? If you're mad because of this tier, don't be mad at me. Be mad at my entire Twitch chat. Okay, be mad at them. But Blood Warden's gonna go down here. I don't think Blood Warden is that great of a perk overall anyway. Tracking is not its primary function, but I just don't really think it's that good. It feels like one of those, like, it's almost like a borderline meme perk, I would say. Like, I would say the majority of the time you're not even gonna get any value out of it whatsoever, and even when you do get value out of it, it's usually just like okay value. Like, it just gives you like an extra hook or two. Obviously sometimes you can like bait the survivors perfectly into like blocking them in and having them all killed, which is really funny, but I would say this is mostly a meme perk. It's not really that strong. It's more like a very niche situation that you can sometimes do, but the tracking is pretty dog shit. It's pretty awful. Okay, next up is Nurse's Calling. So this one is finally, I say finally, it's a second perk. This one is actually a full-blown tracking perk, right? Like, that's the only thing, that's all Nurse's Calling is a tracking perk. This perk makes it, you know what, maybe I should talk about what the perks do, actually. I didn't mention what Blood Warden does, but you know what, that's okay, because it's an honorary mention anyway. Nurse's Calling makes it so that you can see the aura of survivors that are healing within 28 meters. It's pretty simple. That's all it does. If survivors are healing within 28 meters of you, you see their aura, which is pretty solid, honestly. This actually can get a lot of use, especially on like stealth killers. If you're trying to do some kind of a hit and run strategy, it's actually very, very solid. And it's just always been a very, very solid tracking perk, I think. With the introduction of boon totems and also med kits, I say recently, but honestly, they've both okay, like medkits have been buffed for a very long time. Just to quickly explain, if you're maybe like a newer player to DVD, medkits used to be way weaker and used to not heal nearly as fast as you do now, and also boons used to not exist. So like before both of those things changed, this used to be like A tier, borderline S tier. Like a lot of people considered it to be like an S tier perk. But like ever since they changed med kits and you can heal really, really fast, and boons exist, which also helps you heal really, really fast, it's really hard. I'm hovering around A or B tier. It's really hard to say. I think it depends a lot on the killer that you're playing as well, but I do think it is. You know what? Again, if we're talking about just tracking, because again, that's really all it does, is it's just a tracking perk. It has no other use. And if you just want a perk for tracking, I would say it's A tier. I would say it's A tier because I think if you put it in the right build, in the right situation, it does an amazing job at tracking. And even though boons are like kind of strong right now, I actually low-key think that like Nurse's Calling sort of counters Circle of Healing in a really interesting way. It doesn't counter it per se, but if the enemy has a boon up, especially if it's only one boon and you have Nurse's Calling, you can kind of use that boon as like a moth to a flame kind of thing, right? You know for a fact that the survivors will be running to that boon every single time they want to heal. So if you just go near the boon, you'll see their aura when they're healing pretty much every single time. And if you're playing someone that's like a stealth killer, then you're going to kill them, right? I guess the only downside of that is like, what if they have Shadow Step too? Because Shadow Step hides your auras. So you know what? Maybe that's not so strong. Because like there's really no way for you to... Well, I guess... Yeah, it just depends. If it's just Circle of Healing, I think Nurse's Calling is actually really good. If it's Circle of Healing plus Shadow Step, then maybe you're fucked. I'm still going to put it in A tier. I would say if someone wanted to argue that it's not as good as A tier and it belongs to B tier, I think that argument would be okay. But I'm just going to put it in A tier. Next up is BBQ and Chili. BBQ and Chili is a perk that I think most people use just for the blood points. Again, I'll quickly explain. BBQ and Chili is a perk where each time you hook a survivor for the very first time, you get a stack. At the end of the game, you get a bonus 25% blood points for every stack that you get. So you can basically get double blood points every game with it. But also, the additional effect is that when you hook a survivor, all survivors that are more than 40 meters away will have their auras revealed to you for 4 seconds, which is solid. It's solid, although the problem with this perk is that everybody expects it all the time. It's such a popular perk because of the double blood points that like survivors basically just... Like, it's pretty much standard for survivors to just expect every single killer to be running this. And also, Aura Reading has a lot of counterplay. BBQ and Chili in general has a lot of counterplay, right? You know exactly when it's coming because you get alerted when a survivor gets downed, right? Like you know that a survivor's about to be hooked. You get like at least 5 or 10 seconds heads up because you can see them go down, you can see them being picked up, then you have time between them carrying them to the hook and actually throwing them on the hook. You get a big heads up to actually counterplay it. And counterplaying it is literally as simple as jumping in a locker to hide your aura, or literally just crouching on the other side of a generator will hide your aura, or just being within 40 meters, right? There's so many ways to avoid the aura reading that like the aura reading isn't that good. It's not bad either, right? Like if you do see an aura or two on BBQ, it is pretty nice. It kind of gives you like a sense of direction as far as where to go. But the fact that the aura reading is so inconsistent and like it's not like if you hook someone with BBQ and you look out across the map and you see no auras, it's not like you can use that information to be like, oh, they're all within 40 meters. Because no, realistically, at least one or two of them is probably more than 40 meters away and they're just like in a locker or hiding behind a gen. So like the information you get isn't even that like consistent. It's not that valuable. I'd say the best use of this is when you just like see where someone is so that you know where to go to get a chase on like a really mobile killer. Like that's honestly kind of nice. It's weird. I would put it in B tier. I think I'm gonna put it in B tier. It's, again, I know I just talked a lot of shit about it, but I really don't think it's bad. I just think it's kind of overrated. Maybe I think that's what it is. I just think it's overrated. I think a lot of people consider BBQ to be like a really, really good perk, when in reality, I think it's just kind of okay. It's just kind of okay at best. And tracking is really all it does, right? I guess aside from the extra blood points. Okay, Bitter Murmur is the next one, and this is another purely tracking perk. This perk makes it so that when a generator is completed, you see the aura of any survivor within, 16 meters. Okay, I just looked. 16 meters. You see the aura of any survivor within 16 meters of that generator that popped for 5 seconds. So basically, anybody near the gen that pops, you see their aura for like a decent chunk of time. This is okay, and also it has an additional effect where when the very final gen pops, like when they finish all 5 gens, you can see the aura of all survivors, all 4 survivors for 10 seconds, which is kind of, you know, a bigger deal, I would say. Now the effect throughout the match is not that good, right? Like seeing the auras of survivors after a gen pops is probably like one of the least important times to see auras, right? Like they just finished their objective and now they're gonna head elsewhere. So it's not even like the information's not really that important, right? They finished the objective that you're supposed to be protecting. You already kind of like lost that objective. The information doesn't really matter at that point, right? I think I think the best use out of Bitter Murmur is either A, combining it with like perks like Noed in like the end game to try to get an idea to where everyone is. That way you can snowball super hard with Noed, because it can be useful there, right? Seeing where all 4 survivors are for 10 seconds, that's a very long amount of time, right? Because like not only does that tell you where they are, but you could also see the kind of general direction that they're heading, so you can kind of get an idea of what they're doing. If you're a killer that has really good game sense, and if you're like really good like at like the macro strategy part of the game, seeing every survivor for 10 seconds will give you a very good idea of where everyone's going to be for the next like minute. You know what I mean? And if you can potentially snowball really hard when combined with Noed with that in the end game, maybe, even that's a big maybe. Outside of that, the only really other purpose I'd see for it is to try to get like cross map hatchets with Huntress. Like I think that's the only other time I ever see it get used. Is sometimes Huntress mains will use it so that when a gen pops, especially on a map like I don't know, like Rotten Fields or something, the survivors might not realize that you can see their aura and they'll just like run in straight lines and you can just get like easy cross maps, you know? So like it can be fun in that regard, right? Like for Huntress, I would say it's a fun perk, but I wouldn't say it's a good perk. In tandem with Noed, I would say it's still pretty bad. Like it has potential to do okay, but man, you only get 4 perk slots, right? Like you only get 4 perk slots, and I could not imagine replacing an actual good perk with this perk ever. Like I don't think there's ever a time that if I wanted to win a game, I would replace an actual good perk with this. I think it just goes in D tier. I really can't see this perk being good in really any scenario, right? Like there's situations where it's like okay at best. Like I think even when it gets its very best amount of value, I think it's okay at best. So D tier it goes. Okay, up next is Bloodhound. Bloodhound is a perk that makes it so that when survivors bleed while injured, the blood is a lot brighter. It's a lot brighter, and also I think it lasts a little bit longer too. It basically just makes tracking blood a lot easier. Now, this perk is kind of weird because I'm not really sure where I'm going to put this. For the longest time, I've kind of shit on this perk and told people not to run it because I didn't want new players to get like reliant on it, if that makes sense. But I think my mind's kind of changed on it. I'm going to go ahead and just tier this. I think it goes in C tier. I think my thoughts on this perk are if you're kind of like a newer player, this might kind of train you into using blood to track. Because if you're chasing an injured survivor, using the blood pools is a way better way to track than using scratch marks. Scratch marks are they're very vague, right? Like they spread very wide. So sometimes, like for instance, if someone turns a corner, especially on like an indoor map, right, where there's so little vision, if someone like turns a corner, sometimes you'll like come or like if someone goes through like a doorway where like they can go left or right, right? If you come out of that doorway, sometimes scratch marks will be like a little bit to the right and then mostly to the left, and you might see them to the right and you might like just immediately be like, oh, they went right, and then you like look up and there's no more and you're like, ah, shit, and you like hesitate and you can go back left, right? And that might not seem like that big of a deal, but that's a lot of distance you lose. Like following blood trails means that you can see exactly where they're going, right? The blood trail drops directly below the survivor. There's no like room at all for like vagueness or inaccuracy. It is literally a direct trail directly to the survivor. Blood is 100% the best way to track in this game. 100%. Now, the thing about this, though, is that you don't need Bloodhound to track blood, though. Like, I don't think Bloodhound really does that much. I think once you learn to track blood already, then I think you don't need it. However, I do think that maybe new killer players just don't even really think to do it, right? Like, you might not even think to track for blood when you're new. Like, you might not realize how important it is, or maybe how good it is. So maybe Bloodhound would kind of open your eyes to how good blood tracking is and kind of like get you into the habit of doing it. And then eventually you would want to drop this perk and just learn to track blood without it, because you definitely can. It's 100% viable to track blood without this perk. The only time that you can't really use blood tracking is when there's a lot of tall grass, or not even tall grass, just like regular grass, because grass does cover up blood. So like, for instance, if someone runs through, you know, like maybe like the swamp where there's like a lot of grass, it's going to be really hard to follow the blood trail. And even with Bloodhound, even if you have Bloodhound equipped, you still won't be able to see the blood. So again, it's not even like Bloodhound makes the situations better. Any situation that you'd be able to use Bloodhound, you'd be able to do the same exact thing without it. I just think it might be good for a new player to learn. So because of that, I do think it has some use. I'm going to put it in C tier. Again, if you're like an experienced player though, like if you're a very, very good experienced player, this would be like bottom of D tier. But because it does have uses, right, I don't think this is like a completely useless perk. I think it's going to go in C tier. Next up is Dead Man Switch. Now, Dead Man Switch is interesting because this perk, again, most of you will probably look at this perk and think it's mostly a slowdown perk, which you would be right. So to say what this perk does, basically when you hook a survivor, it activates. It's active for 45 seconds. And during those 45 seconds, if anybody is currently working on a gen and they let go, then that gen gets blocked by the entity until Dead Man Switch runs out. So like it's active for 45 seconds. So say you hook somebody and then like 10 seconds after you hook them, someone lets go of a gen. Like you'd be 10 seconds into the activation time, which means that gen would be blocked for 35 seconds, right? Because you'd have 35 seconds left of Dead Man Switch. So this is obviously, I would say it's primarily a slowdown perk because it's mostly about blocking generators. But however, when a generator gets blocked, the aura changes from like the red aura that it usually is to a white aura. And you would actually be, if you have not run this yet, you would be very surprised at how often you just find out where people are. Like, I feel like you don't even need like BBQ and Chili, dude. You hook somebody and you could just like, if you just look around, you'll just see gens randomly getting blocked. And you're like, oh, someone just let go of that, right? And on top of that, the information that it gives you is really important too. Because if you're like nowhere near, like for instance, say you hook somebody on one side of the map and then you start going to like one of like I'm just gonna make up a direction. Say you start going to the east corner, right? Like say you're in the south and you start going to the east corner, and then you look over to the west and a gen over there randomly blocks. You can pretty much figure out in your head like, oh, that person let go of the gen because they're gonna go get the unhook, right? Like there's a lot of information that can tell you depending on when a gen actually gets blocked, where they are when it gets blocked. Like if you have good game sense and you like kind of understand how survivors play, the information that Dead Man Switch gives you is ridiculously valuable, on top of also just being a fucking good slowdown perk, right? Like okay, if this perk was an actual if this tier list was just an actual like general tier list for perks, this would be an S++ perk. Like this is like, in my opinion, one of the best perks in the game right now for killer by far. Like it is an insane perk. This perk is nuts. So even, again, we're only judging it for tracking though. We're not judging it whatsoever for its slowdown. We're only judging it for its tracking. And even in that regard, I'm very tempted to put it in S tier. Like I am actually kind of tempted. I think it's either going to be A tier or S tier. It's going to be really, really close. But this is one of those situations where, like, okay, again, if you remember what I said about Bitter Murmur, like Bitter Murmur gives you information at a time where information isn't that important, right? Like when a gen pops, that's not really an important time to have information. Dead Man Switch gives you information after you hook a survivor, which is a really, really fucking good time to get information, right? When a survivor is on a hook, that's when the survivors are under a lot of pressure, right? They have to go get the unhook. As a killer, you can, if you get another down really quickly, then that compounds the pressure and makes it even worse. You also can play around the unhook, which it kind of like adds this big important objective that the survivors have to take care of. And it's a very like, it's kind of like crunch time, you know what I mean? And getting information during that time is probably the single most valuable time to ever get information. I literally can't think of a single time in the match where information would be more valuable than right after you hook a survivor. Like that is the best time. So again, and it's also consistent, right? Like we talked about BBQ working after a hook, but BBQ is just super inconsistent. Whereas Dead Man Switch, super consistent, And again, any good team is going to be working on gens pretty consistently. So you're most likely going to get a few blocks. Man, do I want to put it in S tier? I'm going to put it in S tier. I'm going to do it. Even though we're just talking about the tracking, I just think the time that it kicks in and also just like how consistently well it works. Yeah, I think it goes in S tier, man. It gives you a lot of good info. Because again, even still, just even to continue to compound onto it, right? Not only does it tell you where survivors are at a very important time of the game, it also reveals what gens they're working on too, which is kind of like a unique tracking in itself, right? I would say if there was a perk that just told you what gen, like if there was a perk that just told you gen progress, kind of like Legion's Ultra Rare add-on, right? If there was a perk that just did that, I would consider that a tracking perk. And I would say that would be a semi-decent tracking perk, right? Like knowing what gens have progress and which ones don't is really good information to have. So like it gives it, I don't know, it just does so much. This does so much in one perk. It's honestly ridiculous. So yeah, I'm gonna put an S tier. I might change it at the end. I think when I get to the end of the video, I might like rearrange a couple things. So we'll see if I stay confident in it being S tier. But for now, yeah, I think I'm gonna put it in S tier. Okay, Deathbound is oh god, Deathbound. Oh god. Is Deathbound a tracking perk? I guess it is. Okay, this perk is it's so bad. This perk is basically when a survivor heals another survivor. Like, dude, there's so many requirements for this perk. It's so ridiculous. Okay, when one survivor heals another survivor more than 32 meters away from you, then that survivor will scream. The survivor that healed them will scream. Now for the next, and that activates Deathbound. Okay, so for the next 60 seconds, Deathbound is active. And if that survivor leaves 8 meters of the survivor that they healed, they become oblivious. So that's what the perk does. That's all it does. So someone heals far. Okay, so when someone heals each other far away from you, it's not even like, it doesn't even work on like healing yourself, right? Like if you run into a corner with a med kit and heal yourself, it doesn't even work on that. It has to be one survivor healing another survivor, right? So one survivor healing another survivor, they scream, they reveal their location, and then they become oblivious. So we're not going to talk about the oblivious part because that's not really relevant to tracking whatsoever. The reason why this is in tracking is because of the scream. Okay, so the honorary mention section is for perks where, like, I feel like the primary function isn't tracking, and tracking is just kind of slapped on as like an additional thing that no one really actually cares about. But, like, what do people care? Like, who the fuck even runs Deathbound? Like, it's so hard for me to even say if this belongs here, because, like, who the fuck runs this perk? It's so bad. It's so horrible. Like, it has, like, two effects, right? It has the screaming, and then it has the obliviousness. So there's, like, it's, like, half and half tracking and half, like, utility, and they're both terrible. You know what I'm actually going to do? I'm literally making an F tier, literally for Deathbound. I don't know if any other perk is going to make it into F tier. This might be the only F tier perk. This perk is really fucking bad. Like, even outside of the tracking tier list, if we're just talking about global tier list, really bad. I cannot imagine a time that this perk would ever be good on a build, ever. Like, there's so many weird requirements for it. Like, why does it have to be more than 32 meters away? Why does it have to be one survivor healing another survivor? Why is it that for them to be oblivious, they have to be more than 8 meters away from the survivor that they healed? It's like, and even then, like, oblivious isn't even that strong of a status effect. On top of that, screams are not, like, okay, when a survivor screams, it's kind of hard to tell how far away they are when they're far away, right? Like, if a survivor screams within, like, 20 meters of you, it's pretty easy to tell exactly where they are. But if a survivor screams, like for instance, if you're in a corner of the map and then someone screams 40 meters away and someone else screams 80 meters away, it's kind of hard to tell exactly where each one is, right? It's just kind of like a little bubble that pops up. It's not like an aura. If it was an aura, it would be good because you would be able to see exactly where they are. But a scream bubble is really, like, it's sometimes very hard to tell where they are. So even the little bit of tracking it does give under, like, the ridiculous circumstances that you have to meet is honestly pretty fucking bad. It's pretty dog shit tracking to begin with. So, like, again, I can't see a world where this perk is ever good to run in any build ever. And it's especially bad with tracking. It's just bad all overall. It's F tier. It's terrible. I feel like I just spent the last, like, 2 minutes just shitting on this, and it honestly deserves it. It's a terrible perk. Okay, Deerstalker. Deerstalker is a perk where you just see the auras of down survivors. Is the range of this still 36 meters? I can't remember. They might have changed it. This perk has been around for so long that I can't remember. 36 meters. Yeah. Okay. That is what it is. So yeah, basically, if people are downed within 36 meters of you, you see their aura. Also, look at this. We have a nice spread of, like, perks in each tier. I swear that wasn't on purpose. That's kind of neat. I mean, we're going to break it right now with Deerstalker, but anyway, so that's all it does, is it just makes it so you can see auras within 36 meters of survivors that are downed. Now, this perk is, I think I already know where it's going to go, so I'm just going to put it there. I want to put it with Bloodhound, because this perk kind of reminds me of Bloodhound in a way. It's a perk where I feel like once you get good enough at the game, you don't really need it as much, but, like, maybe when you're still learning, it might be useful, right? If you're kind of, like, maybe experimenting with, like, when to leave survivors on the ground and not hook them and when to hook them, and maybe you're, like, experimenting with, well, we call it slugging, right? I'm sure most of you know what it means, but maybe if you're, like, a newer player, you might not know what slugging means, but slugging is when you leave someone on the ground instead of picking them up. Like, you down them, and instead of picking them up and hooking them, you just leave them and, like, run around and try to create more pressure. So if you're trying to, like, experiment with slugging and, like, knowing when to slug and stuff, but you're also having trouble keeping track of the people that you down, this helps a lot, right? If you're a good killer player with really, really good game sense, then you don't really need this, right? You can kind of remember exactly where you're down the survivor. You can think about how long ago you did it, and you can kind of get, like, a general, like, area to search for to be able to find them. Even if they crawl away, you kind of have like a general area that you know to search for, because you know that they couldn't have crawled very far, right? Or you know exactly how far they could have crawled based on how long ago you downed them. So again, it's one of those perks that eventually, if you use it as a new player, it's not terrible sometimes, given, you know, depending on what you're doing. But it feels like one of those perks where eventually you're not really going to have any use for it, right? Again, if this tier list was made for like super good experienced players that have like thousands of hours and are very good at the game, then it would probably be like down, you know, here somewhere. I mean, I don't know. It wouldn't be very good. But because again, it kind of helps new players, right? If you're in the process of learning, if you're trying to like, if you're experimenting with slugging and you're trying to figure out when to do it and when not to do it, this could definitely be useful. So I'll put it in C tier. It's pretty much the same exact description I gave Bloodhound, so I'll put it there with Bloodhound. Okay, Discordance is up next, and this one might get me some flack, because Discordance is another perk kind of like Barbecue that I think is a bit overrated. This perk makes it so that if two survivors are working on a gen, or sorry, two or more survivors are working on a gen within 128 meters of you, which is like basically the whole map. I don't think there's any, I don't think there's a single point on any map where you can be over 128 meters away. So I don't even know why they have this. It should just be like globally, but basically if two survivors or more are working on a gen at any point, the gen highlights yellow and it also starts like exploding. Like you'll hear like intermittent like exploding sounds, kind of like skill checks failing, except it's not. And you'll look over and the gen will be yellow, and if you have the perk Discordance, you'll be like, oh, that's Discordance. There's at least two people on that gen. So people like I've heard this perk being called like really good before. I I have a theory that a lot of these perks that like I hear people talking like very highly of, even though I don't think they're very good. Okay, like one theory is I'm just stupid and I have no idea, right? Which is possible. Like maybe I'm an idiot and I just like maybe my views in the game are just wrong. I don't know. But my other theory is that I feel this is actually kind of funny. I don't mean to put this man on blast. He's a very good friend of mine, but I'm gonna say it anyway. I think when Ots was like really hardcore, like deep diving into this game and like experimenting with every perk super heavily, I think there was a lot of perks where he was like a fan of them and he talked them up a lot, and then people were like, that perk's amazing. And this is one of them. I think we actually have another one in this tier list that I'm going to talk about at one point too, that is kind of the same way. Because again, I feel like right around when Ots started blowing up at the DBD scene is when people started being like, dude, Discordance is amazing. And I'm like, wait, what? Like, where is this coming from? This perk is not that good. It's like okay at best. So anyway, I don't know. I don't know if that's really it. Maybe I'm just an idiot. Maybe it is a god tier perk. But like here's my opinion on it. I'm gonna tier it. I think it goes in. Ooh, I think I'm gonna put it in B tier. Okay, and let me give my reasoning. Okay, I think there's pros and cons of this perk. This perk again is just a tracking perk, so like there's really no need to give further thoughts on it. That goes with a lot of the last few perks. I know I said I was going to give my overall thoughts on them, but a lot of these perks have been strictly tracking perks, right? Deerstalker, Bloodhound, these are all strictly tracking perks and nothing else. Discordance is also strictly a tracking perk, so there's really no need to talk about anything else about it. This perk is nice. Because okay, I'll talk about the pros first. Okay, this perk is good because when it activates, right, like if you do get it to activate, then you know for a fact that there's more than one survivor on a generator, and that is really good. Like if you go to a generator that has more than one survivor on it and you like chase them off of it, or you know, like do whatever, like if you go defend that generator, that's really good because you're pressuring multiple survivors at the same time. Does that make sense? Like hypothetically, if 4 single survivors were on 4 different generators around the map, and you ran to one of those generators, you would only be chasing one survivor while the other 3 are completely uncontested. They can literally sit there and hold M1 on their gen with literally 0 interruption. They have not a care in the world. Whereas, say if you turn that around and you say all 4 of those survivors are on one gen as opposed to being on 4 different gens, if you find that one gen, then all 4 survivors have to let go. They have to run away, right? And then you can like run around, chase them, hit them, and even if you just chase one of them away, the other 3 still let go of the generator temporarily, right? And again, and that's kind of how this is. Like even if Discordance is only 2 people, if you hit one, hit the other, and then, you know, commit to one of them, then that's still 2 people that were off of gens for like a solid portion of time, right? You're like actively chasing them off gens, which buys you time. It doesn't seem like, it might not seem like much to only chase people off gens for maybe like 10-20 seconds before they could just get right back on it, but it honestly adds up. Like that adds up a lot. Pressuring multiple survivors at the same time like that is huge as killer. And if you like if you're ever in a situation where like multiple survivors aren't pressured and like there's like 2-3 survivors that are just free to just do gens at their leisure around the map, that's when the gens get done instantly, and that's when killers will start crying about being gen rushed. So again, when it activates, really good value. You pressure multiple survivors at once, and it's really, really good. But the downsides are, first off, sometimes it just never fucking activates. Like, I can't tell you how many times I've run this perk and it just doesn't even come into play a single time throughout the whole game. Like, it just never activates. And it's like, oh, so it's just a dead perk, right? So first off, there's that, right? There's like the risk that it just might not activate ever. Because honestly, again, good survivor play is splitting up and doing different gens. So like, if they're doing gens together, they're already kind of playing less efficiently than if you were, if you were to split up. So, it kind of like counters bad gameplay, and then it doesn't counter good gameplay, if that makes sense. Like, this does nothing when survivors play properly, and when survivors play improperly, like when they play inefficiently, then it does something. So it's like weird, right? Like, why do you want help against survivors that are playing improperly when you think you would want help against the survivors that are playing properly? Like, that's the people that you would want help against. So like, that's another thing that kind of sucks about it. And I will say that the majority of times that this perk activates is usually when there's like one gen left, right? Because that's when there's a really, really good chance that multiple survivors will be on the same gen. Yeah, right? Like that's when things like Prove Thyself become really, really strong, is when there's one gen left and the killer is just trying to make sure that the final gen doesn't pop, because multiple survivors can jump on one of the gens and get it done really quickly, right? And the thing about that, though, is that when you're in that scenario, again, just like these perks down here, if you have good game sense, you probably already know what gens the survivors are trying to work on, right? Like, there's going to be very few situations where a very experienced good killer player gets down to the last gen and they're like, I don't know what gen they're trying to work on. Like, you're almost always going to know what gen they're trying to pressure. Like, it's usually pretty fucking obvious what gen has progress and which one they're trying to get progress on. You don't really need Scourge to tell you. So again, it's one of those perks where like, I think even a little bit of value it does get ends up just not even really being that big of a deal anyway, because I feel like just as a good player, you don't really, like, you don't need it, right? You don't need it. You already just figure it out on your own. That being said, though, I know I just shit on it for like, a minute straight, so you guys are probably wondering why it's in B tier. I do gotta say, though, again, if the survivors play like inefficiently and they have multiple people on like one gen, like in like the early or mid game, it does give insane value. Like, it really, really does give insane value. It gives you a lot of information, right? Like, knowing that there are multiple survivors in one little section of the map is, first off, just good information, right? Like, if at any point in the game you know where all 4 survivors are, that's really good information. I talked about this when it came to Bitter Murmur. But like, if at any point in the time you know where all 4 survivors are, that's super good, right? You can kind of know, again, you could use game sense with that to kind of know exactly what they're going to do. So say hypothetically, you see one person and then you see another person to your right, so you chase the person to your right, and then a gen way across the map then lights up with discordance. You then know where all 4 survivors are, right? Like, that's really, really good. There's situations like that where like the tracking of just knowing our survivors are is really good. Also, again, the fact that you can pressure multiple survivors off the gens at once is really good. There's like a few things that make this really good. It also has synergy with like certain killers and certain builds that you could run too that kind of revolve around people grouping up on gens, but that's a whole nother topic. So again, when the effect does kick in, it's solid. It's just, I feel like it's not like God tier. Like, if you wanted to have a really, really good perk that helps you beat like really good players, I don't think Discordance is it. I don't think Discordance is it at all. It's also just not a very consistent perk either. So it's inconsistent, and it also doesn't help you against like actual really, really good teams of players. So B tier is as high as it goes. And even B tier, I think, is being generous. I think this could be dropped into C tier, and I literally wouldn't even bat an eye. D tier is too low, but I think it can go into C tier, and I wouldn't even bat an eye. But I'll put it in B tier because I do think the effect is decent. Okay, Dragon's Grip. This one is. Ooh, should this one go on honorary mention? I don't know. This perk is basically like when you kick a generator. Dragon's Grip activates. What's the timings? Hold on. It's kind of sad that I have 9,000 hours, and I don't know like. I guess I mean, am I really expected to know all the numbers of every single perk, especially perks that are dog shit? I guess it's not sad. Like, maybe it's not sad. I think that's just the nature of DBD having 20,000 bajillion fucking perks. Okay, so when you kick a generator for the next 30 seconds, it's like, this perk is basically active on that generator. If a survivor works on that gen in the next 30 seconds after kicking it, they scream, revealing their location, and then they also get exposed for 60 seconds, and then it goes on cooldown for like 80 seconds afterwards. So again, as far as tracking goes, the only tracking is the scream, right? So this is a weird perk because obviously people use this for the exposed, right? Like people use it strictly to get people exposed and then down them with it. But like, I guess like hypothetically, if it didn't have the scream, then how would you know the gen was worked on, right? So you like the scream is tracking, right? Like the scream tells you that it was worked on so that you can then be like, oh, hey, someone's on that gen that I kicked with Dragon's Grip, time to go back and down them. So like, I guess it is tracking, right? Right? I guess. Like, I'm not sure if I should put this in honorary mention or not. I don't know. FYI, as far as like the tier of this perk is trash tier. Like, if this was a genuine, like, just overall perk tier list, which honestly, maybe I'll do someday, I'd probably put it in like D tier at tops. Like, this perk heavily relies on survivors playing very, very confident and basically like coming back and tapping the gen the second you walk away. And also being bad enough that they don't position well enough to actually avoid being down for 60 seconds, which a good survivor can do a lot of the time. So not a very good perk. The tracking itself is also not great. Like, again, if we're talking about it from a tracking point of view, you're kicking a gen that you know someone is near, right? Like, if you're using Dragon's Grip, you're almost always kicking a gen that you know somebody's near because you're trying to bait them into working on it, right? So it's not actually telling you anything. Like, it tells you if a survivor works on that gen again, but like that's not like, you know, a survivor's over there. So like, I'm putting it in honorary mention. I don't know. I feel like, again, it's not really telling you where people are. It's not really telling you much of anything other than that they got back on the gen. But I feel like you can kind of just assume that anyway, right? Like, you're usually doing that because you know somebody was working on it, and then you walk away. You can just assume that they're probably going to do it anyway. So yeah, it's going in honorary mention. I don't think this is even like, it's hardly a tracking perk. I think that's a stretch to even call it a tracking perk. Okay, Gearhead is the next one. Oh man, Gearhead. So Gearhead just recently got buffed, I guess. I don't even know, like, buffed. It got changed. You know, I'll call it a buff. I'll definitely call it a buff. It got buffed recently, and now it does something entirely different than what it used to. And basically, what it does now is when you, I think it's when a survivor loses a health state by any means. So it's one of those types of perks, right? When a survivor loses a health state by any means. So if you hit a survivor with your weapon, if, you know, a survivor heals another survivor with, like, for the people and they go broken, you know, if they lose a health state by any means at all, then Gearhead activates. And while it's active, any survivor that hits a great skill check on a generator, they have to be working on a generator and they have to hit a great skill check, then their aura is revealed to you for 10 seconds. And like 10 seconds is like a decent amount of time. But like, also, they're like, the majority, like, I'd be willing to bet that the whole 10 seconds is just going to be them sitting on a gen anyway, right? Like, does it matter if it's 10 seconds or 4 seconds? Like, they're just going to be sitting on a gen anyway. And that's all it does. That's the whole thing. It activates when someone loses a health state. If someone hits a great skill check, shows their aura for 10 seconds. But only if they're on a gen. So, I don't know, man. It's really weird. Like, this is a really weird perk because it's like, what I guess my question is, why great skill checks? Why does it have to be a great skill check? I think if this perk worked on any skill check, it actually would be pretty solid. As a matter of fact, I would say if it worked on good skill checks instead of greats, it would be at least better. The fact that it only works on great skill checks is so weird because I would say, like, a lot of survivors don't even go for great skill checks. A lot of them just go for good skill checks. And skill checks are already random in themselves, right? Like, it's 100% possible to do a gen from start to finish without getting a single skill check the whole time. Or sometimes you only get like 1 or 2, right? So this is just like the definition of inconsistent. Like, there's so much RNG. The survivors have to get a skill check. They also have to hit a great skill check, which is just not like super common. And even then, you see the aura of one survivor, and you see, and again, that survivor's just working on a gen. It kind of just tells you what gen is being worked on, right? And that's basically it, which I guess is okay, right? It's probably better than old Gearhead, but it's still not like, I don't know. You also don't control when it kicks in, right? That's like another big thing. Perks where you don't really like perks like this that like show you auras of people, but you can't really control when it happens. It makes it a lot less good. I guess a big reason why I don't like Bitter Murmur, because you don't really control when it happens. Perks like Dead Man Switch, it activates after you hook a survivor, right? You're in control of like when it activates. It activates at a good time every time. Like, this could activate while you're busy, right? Like, you could be like in the middle of trying to like do an elaborate mind game at a jungle gym when this activates, and then you're like, oh shit, wait, Gearhead's active. Let me figure out what the fuck this guy is while I'm also chasing this guy and trying to mind game him. Like, I don't know. It's just not that good. Like, there are maybe certain niche situations where this will be really useful, right? Because again, like, maybe you're in a scenario where, like, you have a guy on a hook and then you're chasing another guy and you see the third guy and you're like, well, I don't know where the fourth one is, but here's 3 of them. And then all of a sudden Gearhead activates and the fourth guy is the whole way across the map. And you're like, bam, there's the information I need, baby. And then you can make the proper play, right? Like, maybe little things like that would be good, but it's just so inconsistent, dude. Like, it's just so inconsistent. Like, again, this tier list is meant to be, like, looked at as if you were, like, thinking about making a build and you're like, hey, I want a tracking perk. Like, I want a perk that will help me find survivors or help me get information that I need at important times, right? And Gearhead is just not that. Like, that is not, I would never look at Gearhead as a perk where I'm like, yeah, that perk definitely feeds me good information at times that are important. Like, no. Never. I would never say that. It's super inconsistent. It might be valuable once in a blue moon, and that's it. I'm going to put it in D tier. It's not quite Deathbound tier. I don't think anything's going to be Deathbound tier, dude. Deathbound is really fucking bad. It's probably like Bitter Murmur tier. It's similar in a lot of ways, right? You can't control when the timing kicks in. The information isn't really that important. It's just kind of meh. It's just kind of meh. Okay, Overcharge. Oh, this is another one where, like, I think this is another one where, like, Twitch chat forced me to put this in. Overcharge is a perk where when you kick a generator, the next time a survivor goes to work on that generator, they'll get hit with a really hard skill check, kind of similar to like Decisive Strike. If they fail that skill check, then the gen regresses like an additional, I think, like 5 or 6%. So it's basically like you kick a gen, next time they work on it, hard skill check, you know. This is mostly used for like 3 gen strategies, right? They were trying to hold 3 gens that are close to each other. You can run around kicking it with Overcharge, and then if the survivors aren't good at skill checks, it'll just regress a fuck ton. And again, the reason why it's in tracking, like, it sounds like it's just pure regression, right? Because it mostly is. It's mostly regression. But the reason why it's in tracking is because if they fail the skill check, it reveals where they are, right? Like, a failed skill check makes an explosion sound, and then you know where they are. So, like, if you kick a gen with Overcharge and then walk away from it, and you know what? I would actually say that a lot of killer players would run Overcharge with that in mind, too, right? Because, again, like, I don't think anyone runs Dragon's Grip for the tracking or Blood Warden for the tracking, which is why they're down here. But Overcharge, again, I think if you're setting up an entire build to be based around holding down a 3-gen, a lot of players do that, right? I don't think it's necessarily a smart play because you could always just hit the skill check. But a lot of people, like, they'll like kick a gen with Overcharge, and if they don't hear the explosion of someone failing the skill check, they just assume that no one's working on it, you know? And they kind of use it as like a way to tell them that someone tapped the gen. So like, it does get used, I guess, in that way for tracking. Oh, maybe this is joining Deathbound in the F tier. I think if we can even consider this a tracking perk at all, it's F tier, right? Again, I don't think it's F tier as far as like the regression. It's not good, don't get me wrong. It's not a great perk, but it's not this bad as far as the regression goes. Like, this perk will be involved in the slowdown tier list, and it's not going to be in the F tier. It'll be a little bit higher at least. So I don't think it's like an F tier perk overall, but if we're talking about strictly the tracking, then I mean, yeah, because again, I think some people do actually use this for the sake of tracking. I don't think it belongs in the honorary mention. I think it actually does belong in the tier list. I'm gonna put it above Deathbound though, because this perk is just so bad. So I'm gonna at least put it above Deathbound. I don't even know if this matters. I don't know if I'm gonna be putting them in order. I just wanted for Deathbound in particular, I want to make sure it's at the very last. Because God, is that perk terrible. Okay, Hangman's trick is this one's mostly tracking. This is a perk where when you're carrying survivors, you can see the auras of survivors if they're within 6 meters of a hook. And then you also, it has like an additional benefit of like if someone starts saboing a hook, you get like a notification of it, which I wouldn't really say is tracking because it's usually pretty obvious when someone's going to sabo a hook that you're trying to hook somebody on. So that's, I don't even really consider that like a part of this perk. I feel like this perk is mostly just like the aura reading within 6 meters of a hook when you're carrying somebody. This perk is a shame because I feel like it has potential to be kind of decent. If you guys actually don't know, when they first reworked this perk, like maybe like a year or two ago, on the PTB, it was 12 meters instead of 6. And I don't know if you guys know, but a 12 meter radius from every hook is pretty much the entire map, because that's pretty much how far away they are spaced away from each other, right? They're about like probably like 20 meters spaced away. So a 12 meter radius was huge. And on that PTB, this perk was actually OP. Everyone ran it on the PTB because basically while you were carrying survivors, you could just see the auras of while you were carrying a survivor, you can see the auras of everyone. It's all the time. It was nuts. And then they reduced it to 6 meters. Honestly, I think they could probably bump it up to like 8 meters, and I think it would still be like, it wouldn't be OP, but it would be at least a little bit more useful. Because at 6 meters, it's just honestly not good. I think it's going to go into D tier. It's not, again, there's sometimes it gives you good information, right? There's definitely sometimes where the information it can provide can be really, really solid. Sometimes you'll be carrying someone to a hook, and you'll look around and you'll see some person like randomly like crouching in like a bush or something, and they'll think that they're hidden. Because like another thing about Hangman's trick is that nobody expects it, right? No one expects you to have Hangman's trick. So like for instance, somebody that might be trying to avoid barbecue, they might like crouch in a bush close to like you while you're hooking a survivor, right? Thinking like, hey, I'm gonna be within 40 meters to avoid barbecue and chili because that's such a popular perk. And maybe there's a hook nearby, and while you're hooking them, you see them crouching in the bush, right? Like again, there's little instances like that where this actually can get some decent value. Like I've ran this perk a few times. I've done a lot of randomizer videos. I've done a lot of dumb builds. I've ran this perk a few times, and it actually does get decent value sometimes. It's just rare. It's just rare to get good value. The majority of the time, this perk doesn't really do much at all, which again is very similar to these perks, right? That feels like it's right in line with these perks. Sometimes it's useful, but more often than not, it's dog shit. So, yep, D tier it is. Okay, Hex Retribution. This is a perk where, this is a perk where basically it's like a support hex. Essentially, if any totem is cleansed, the survivor that cleanses it is oblivious for 60 seconds. And if a hex totem is cleansed, they're oblivious for 60 seconds, but then also it reveals the auras of all survivors for, I believe it's 16 seconds? 15 seconds. Whatever, close enough. 15 seconds. Which is a long time. 15 seconds is a long ass time to see auras. Like that is no joke. And again, we mentioned this with Bitter Murmur, and I'm going to keep talking about it multiple times throughout this video because it's very important. The seeing all 4 survivors at the exact same time is really good information, especially when it's long periods of time, right? Like 15 seconds gives you a good idea of what they're doing, like, and like where they're going, what their plans are, right? Like you can see like what gens they might be going to, if people are maybe going for saves, you know, like it just gives you an idea of like what they're doing and also what they're going to be doing. So the information it gives you is actually kind of nuts. However, it's reliant on them breaking totems. So like the only way to force them to break totems is to combine it with other totem perks. And even then it's like, is it worth it? Like it's not terrible, but it's not great, right? Like this isn't something that you can run completely solo. I mean, you could, but it's not going to be very good, right? Like it's most likely just not even going to get cleansed if you run it solo because survivors don't have any hexes that are bothering them, right? Like to get people to cleanse hexes these days, you need them to like feel the need to, right? You need to have like Hex Ruin up, or you need to have like 3 stacks to Devour or something. You need to like make them feel like they need to. Otherwise, they're just going to leave them all alone. So like it feels like you need other perks to make it work. I will say a really good combination is Hex Retribution plus Hex Haunting Ground is a really good combination. Haunting Ground makes it so that when you break it, they get exposed for 60 seconds. So them being exposed while you're able to see their aura is nuts. Because again, you can know where they're going and what they're doing, which means you can potentially snowball, right? Like you can down whoever's closest to you and then immediately go to like the second closest person and possibly down them too, which is a lot of pressure, right? And even still, the person that you're chasing, you can see their aura the whole time that you're chasing them, so it makes it really hard for them to like out mind game you when you see exactly what they're doing. So like the value that it has potential to get good value. And I think it has more potential to get good value than the perks in D tier. Like I know that I was talking about the perks in D tier being like sometimes they get good value, but the majority of the times they don't. I think Retribution's a step above that. I think Retribution is the opposite, where it's like it gets good value a decent chunk of the time, but then there's also like a slightly, like I would say like more often than not it probably gets decent value, but there's still like a lot of instances where it doesn't get very much value at all. So I think it's going in C tier. I think that's where I don't think it's quite on like the level of like the Scourge or barbecue as far as tracking. Again, the fact that like it requires you to have like an entire build based around it as well kind of is a weird like part of it as well, right? Like you need to have very specific perks just to make it work. Otherwise it does essentially nothing. So yeah, I think C tier is where it belongs. It's not bad, not good either. It's just kind of you know, it's just kind of meh. And this does have the additional Oblivious effect, but honestly, that's barely even a part of this. I think Oblivious doesn't really matter that much at all. This is probably like the overall ranking of the perk too is C tier, I would say. Next up is Hex Undying. This is again, this is another one where like I wasn't even going to include it because, you know what, actually, wait, you know, actually, now that I'm thinking about it, this is actually good. I'm actually glad we did include it because, okay, this perk makes it so that, like, okay, the primary function of this perk is basically it's like a replacement for a hex totem. Like, essentially, if you're running this perk with another hex totem, when the first totem gets broken, it'll always be Undying. Like, it'll either be Undying or it'll be another totem, and Undying will basically take its place. So it's basically like a free get out of jail free card for a hex totem. But before they break a hex totem, like if they don't break a single hex totem and Undying is still up, then any survivor that's within, I think it's 2 meters, or is it 4 meters? 4 meters. 4 meters of a dull totem. Any survivor that's within 4 meters of a dull totem has their aura revealed to you, which is honestly not bad nowadays, right? Like, first off, that can be okay just because, you know, sometimes you'll get random aura reading when people happen to run through like maze tiles or something, right? Like, sometimes it just kicks in randomly and you'll be like, oh, hey, a random aura, you know, and it's kind of nifty. But the real value there is boons. You know, people like booning. Boons are pretty popular these days, and, you know, people usually go after like a dull totem to boon it. So if your Undying is still up whenever they go to set a boon, you can literally see them the entire time they're doing it. Like, the entire like 14 or 16 seconds or however long it takes. You could literally just watch them do it from start to finish. So first off, you can run over there and chase them off of it, which wastes their time and also gets you probably a free hit. Or B, if they do finish the boon, you know exactly where it is, right? Like, you know exactly where they put it, which also gives you really good information, right? Like, if we're talking about tracking, that's good tracking, right? It tracks boon perks. It tracks survivors booning, and it also tracks boon perks. I mean, the thing that sucks is that, again, Undying goes away the first time any hex gets destroyed. So, like, it doesn't usually last that long, right? This isn't like a tracking perk. Like, I think the tracking aspect of this perk is not going to be lasting like super long throughout games. But like in the earlier part of the game, it actually does provide a decent bit of value. And because of that, I think I'm going to put it in D tier. I think I'm going to put it in D tier. I think it belongs right around with these guys, where like sometimes it'll give you some pretty solid value. Most of the times, though, tracking is going to basically do nothing at all. Again, this is strictly for the tracking. If this was an overall tier list, this would be much, much higher. This is going to be showing up in the utility tier list, and it's going to be very high on the utility tier list. I think Hex Undying is like probably like an A tier perk, maybe. I don't know. I'd have to think about it more, but it's a very good perk. This is a very, very strong perk, especially if you're trying to keep hex totems up. But specifically for tracking, what this tier list is based on, it's a D tier. The tracking is not that good. Okay, next up is Hoarder. Oh, bro. Hoarder is a perk. This perk makes it so that 2 additional chests spawn, first off. So the default is 3. It bumps it up to 5. 5 chests spawn by default, unless, you know, obviously they can burn coins and stuff. So 2 additional chests spawn in the map. And anytime that a survivor is within 64 meters of you, and also if they unlock a chest or if they pick up an item, then there's a loud noise notification, kind of like a failed skill check explosion, right? There's like a loud like explosion notification, and you can see like a kind of it's like a unique one, like, you know, it's Hoarder. There's like a image of like someone digging through a chest or whatever. Like, you can tell it's Hoarder, like when it happens. But you basically get a noise notification, and it reveals the location of the survivor that did it. So it's like an anti-plundering perk. Basically, it's really weird. It's basically like a big middle finger to people who like to plunder chests. Which is really odd because, like, I'm not sure why you would want to discourage that. Like, I feel like when survivors are plundering chests, that's usually when they're, like, messing around and having fun and not really tryharding, right? Like, usually when you're, like, sweating your ass off as survivor, you're, like, just slamming gens and trying to get out as fast as possible. Like, you're just trying to get the objectives done, right? Like, if you're messing around and looting chests, you're not hurting anybody, you know? Leave them alone. Leave the poor loot goblins alone. They're just trying to get their loot. You know what I mean? Like, what the hell? So, like, I already don't like this perk just because of the primary function of it. Although I will say that picking up an item actually counts for Pinhead's Lament configuration, which is important because chasing the person that has a Lament configuration as Pinhead is very good to do. So this is actually like I don't know if I would call it meta, but I would call it like semi-meta. It's like a semi-meta Pyramid Head perk, which is kind of interesting, right? Wait, did I say Pyramid Head or Pinhead? Pinhead. It's a semi-meta Pinhead perk. And that makes it hard to judge it, though. That makes it really hard to judge it. I think outside of Pinhead, I might put it in F tier. Like, it's pretty awful. It's pretty dog shit. It's pretty, right? Like, what? Who cares about people like looting chests? Like maybe I guess the benefit would be if someone loots basement chest, you could then go kill them in the basement, and getting a basement hook is really, really valuable. So maybe you can say it's really valuable there. You know what? Because of that, I'm going to put it in D tier. You know what? I kind of forgot about basement chest. If you catch someone out in basement chest, that's kind of a big deal, right? You can just go down, kill them, and then hook them in basement. And a basement hook is a big deal. Like, that's a big thing to get as killer. And on top of that, again, the fact that it has such good synergy with Pinhead makes me feel like, again, this was the tier where I was saying, you know, sometimes it gets pretty good value, but the majority of the time it does nothing at all. That sounds about right for Hoarder, right? That sounds about right for Hoarder. So it sometimes does cool shit. Most of the time it does nothing at all. It's pretty much D tier. Okay, Lullaby. This one's kind of like Overcharge. Because, okay, what Lullaby does is it's a Hex Totem. And it's a weird one. It's a Hex Totem that requires it requires staying up for a while because you get stacks every time you hook somebody, right? And for every time you hook somebody, there's like a sound that plays before you get a skill check, right? I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. There's like a sound, it's like a little ding, and then the skill check pops up. For every stack you get, that ding sound is slightly less delayed. So like if you get like 4 stacks, it's like by the time you hear the ding, the skill check is already on the screen. So you have like less time to like prepare for it. And then when you get to 5 stacks, there's no ding sound at all, and the skill check just pops up silently. So also, if you fail a skill check, you get like a little bit more regression as well. So it's kind of like a slowdown in that way. Like, it's kind of a perk that's designed to make people fail skill checks is essentially what it is. It's essentially its purpose. It's designed to make you fail skill checks. And it's also, it makes it so when you do fail a skill check, you regress a little bit more. So again, this is primarily slowdown. But again, just like Overcharge, you know, my Twitch chat, they were telling me, hey, Tofu, well, you know, when survivors fail skill checks, it lets you know where they are. So technically, a perk designed around making you fail skill checks technically is tracking because you see where they are when they fail the skill check or whatever, right? And like, I guess, right? I guess. And you know what? I would even say, like, when you're thinking about running Undying, like, or sorry, I saw Undying. When you're thinking about running Huntress Lullaby, I mean, I don't know why you would even run this. This perk is awful. This perk is a very, very bad perk, by the way. But if you are considering running it, I feel like that might play a role in it, right? Like, people failing skill checks is good because of the regression, but it also gives you info. Like, it is a big part of the perk, is the info as well as the regression. So, dude, there's a lot of D tier perks. I'm gonna say D tier. The main problem with this perk is that it's a Hex Totem, which means it can get destroyed, and also it takes a while to get the stacks going. You know what? I'm putting this in F tier. I just thought about it for a little bit longer, and it's going in F tier. Because, okay, it's a Hex Totem, which means it's like it's limited, right? It's got a limited lifespan. It's very rare that Huntress Lullaby is going to stay up the entire game. Very rare. Almost never going to happen. As a matter of fact, the majority of the time, it's probably gonna die before you could even get any substantial amount of stacks on it. That's usually how it goes. And then even if you do get stacks, though, like even if you manage to get to like 3, 4, or 5 stacks, survivors can counter it by just simply hitting the skill checks, right? Like, if they're just good at hitting skill checks and if they're paying attention and just don't miss, then the perk does literally nothing at all, right? And good survivors can do that. You know what I mean? Like, good survivors are pretty good at hitting skill checks. It's not really that much of a problem for them. So I feel like if you're going up against like a really good team of survivors, this perk is doing nothing for you other than just wasting a slot in your build. So I'm not even going to put it in D tier. I just think it's not good. Like, there are some niche situations. I almost put it in D tier because there are some of these situations where you can get to a lot of stacks, and you'll also be playing against people who maybe aren't the best at doing skill checks, and sometimes it'll get like really nutty amounts of value. Like, it is hypothetically possible, right? It's happened before. I've seen it happen before. It's happened to me. It's possible. I just feel like it's so unlikely. And also, even when that does happen, that really only happens against survivors that aren't that good, right? This does nothing against survivors that are actually good. And why would you want to, like, again, to me, it's like, why would I want to run a perk that only works against bad survivors? Like, if I'm running perks, I want perks to help me when I run into survivors that are really good. Those are the perks that I want, not Lullaby. So Lullaby is going in F tier, and I think that's where it's staying. Next up is Infectious Fright. Oh, baby, Infectious Fright. Let's go. I love Infectious Fright. This perk is pretty simple. Basically, when you down a survivor by any means, any survivors that are within your tear radius, they scream, revealing their position. That's it. Real simple. Real simple, and it's fucking S tier. This perk is really, really good. If you're looking for tracking, this is, again, we talked about how it's important when the tracking comes in, right? When the tracking actually kicks in is really important. And we talked about that with Deadman Switch, right? Deadman Switch kicked in after you got a hook. Infectious Fright kicks in after you get a down. And this works really well on certain killers, right? Like this perk, depending on the killer, it can be like kind of good or like kind of meh. But on the killers that it's good on, it's really fucking good on. This is probably like the #1 snowball perk in the entire game. Like this is like the best perk for snowballing in the entire game, I think. Especially like in just like your random like public matches where, you know, like people are going to be playing really sloppy and you're going to be able to take advantage of it, right? Because that's how it always is. This perk is nuts. Because basically snowballing is like the best way to win in DBD ever. Like it's like the best strategy. If you could ever like pull off a good snowball, it's game over every time. And to explain what I mean by snowballing, because I know sometimes I say this exact kind of stuff on stream and then people ask me. So again, most of you guys might know what I'm talking about already, but in case you don't know what I mean by snowballing, it's the snowball effect, right? The snowball effect is like when a snowball is rolling down a hill, it just keeps growing and growing and growing and getting bigger and bigger and bigger, right? That's the idea of snowballing, right? If you're snowballing pressure, that means you're using the pressure to get more pressure, and then that built up pressure gets even more pressure, and you get more and more pressure, right? Like you're using your pressure to get more, and then as you get more pressure, you use that more pressure to get even more. I feel like I'm just saying the word more over and over again, but I hope that makes sense, right? So like, for instance, an example of this would be you're playing as Oni, right? And you pop your power, and you're in your like Blood Fury. You down a survivor in one hit. You know, you have Infectious Fright, and 2 other survivors around you scream. You don't even bother picking up the survivor. You leave him on the ground, right? Because if you stop to pick that survivor up and hook him, while you're taking the time to pick him up and hook him, those 2 survivors are running the fuck away and getting to safety. So instead of picking him up, you leave him on the ground, which is what we were talking about earlier with Deerstalker. You know, you slug them, you leave them on the ground, and then you go down one of those other people, right? So like if you go find one of those other people and down them, then there's another person on the ground. There's 2 survivors on the ground bleeding out. And then say someone else screams from that one and you start chasing them, all of a sudden you have so much map pressure, right? Because there's 2 people on the ground bleeding out. You're chasing the 3rd survivor. That means that 2 survivors are literally on the ground, unable to do anything. And the 4th survivor that might have been like doing gens or doing something else now has to get off the gen to come pick people up, which means nobody's working on gens. Everybody's kind of like focused on just like keeping their team from dying at that point, right? And that's what like snowballing is. That's what snowballing is. That's what compounding map pressure is. It's a big part of winning in Dead by Daylight. If you can ever get like a snowball going, it's nuts. You can basically stop all gen progress if you snowball hard enough for like pretty much any extended period of time, right? As long as you're consistently getting downs, it could happen forever, right? And again, once you start snowballing, you can keep it going. Like even in that scenario I talked about, say that 4th survivor runs back and picks somebody up. If you down the person you're chasing, you can then go back and like pressure the people that just got picked up. Like you can just keep using the pressure that you have to get more pressure. It's wild. And Infectious Fright is literally the single best perk in the game for doing that. I think, right? Definitely the best tracking perk. Definitely the best tracking perk in the game for doing that. It might be the best perk in the game overall for doing that, but it's definitely the best tracking perk for doing that. Like if you are playing a killer that has a very strong chase, if you're playing, like I gave the example of Oni and his power, like this perk is like a staple perk on Oni, but not even Oni, even a killer like Nurse, right? If you're a really good Nurse player with Infectious Fright, you will just annihilate games. Like you will just slaughter people. Because you'll just be constantly like, if you down someone and there's anyone near you, you'll immediately know where they are and you can just immediately kill them because they're close to you, right? It gives you really good information. The information it gives you is important because it happens after a down. And like I said, when someone's downed or when they're hooked is a really important time because that gives the survivors an additional objective, right? The survivors have to come help that person or else that person can't do gens. It's like one person is off of gens until they get helped. So someone needs to help them. It's a very important time of the match. So it gives you information right when that happens. And also the information it gives you is it's like, hey, we're going to let you know if anybody's around you. So again, that's also so important. The fact that it reveals close to you is also important. If it revealed where people were miles away, it wouldn't be nearly as good. But the fact that it reveals where people are close to you means that it tells you exactly where people are so that you can immediately go and snowball, right? You immediately know where the next person is that you need to go chase to like continue creating the pressure to get that compound pressure going. It's just nuts. And not only that, not only does it tell you where people are, it also tells you where people aren't, if that makes sense. Like if you down someone and nobody screams around you, then you know that you should pick up, right? You know that in that situation, there's no point in slugging because you know that there's nobody around you. Obviously, unless they have like Calm Spirit or something, but who the fuck runs Calm Spirit? You know that there's nobody around you, so you can just pick up safely. You know that slugging would not matter. There's no point in slugging. Nobody is close enough to matter. So you pick up and hook, and you know that it's the right decision. It just gives you such important information at such a important part of the game, right? And it's honestly, I'm literally gonna like adjust it to be the top of the S tier right now, because this perk is really, it's probably my favorite tracking perk in the whole game. Well, my second favorite tracking perk in the whole game. I'll get to my favorite one later, but it's really fucking good. Really, really good. Definitely S tier. Like, I wasn't super confident in putting Deadman Switch S tier. Very confident in Infectious Fright. Okay, next up is Iron Maiden. Iron Maiden's a weird one too, because this one is like I think this perk is going to be in like 3 different categories. It's going to be in like 3 different tier lists, because this does a lot of everything. This perk basically makes it so that when a survivor jumps out of a locker, they scream, revealing their position, and it also makes them exposed for, I believe, 30 seconds. Yeah, 30 seconds. So they scream, and it reveals their position for 30 seconds. Now, we've already discussed that screaming is not always, like, super accurate, right? Like, if you're the whole way across the map and someone screams, it's sometimes hard to pinpoint exactly where they were. But also, on top of this, the expose only lasts for 30 seconds, so, like, it's not really that big of a deal. But again, we're not talking about the expose. We're talking about the tracking. The tracking is just them screaming when they jump out of a locker, right? It also makes you check lockers faster, which is also another thing as well, which maybe you can count that as tracking, right? Like, opening lockers faster is mostly used, like, that part of the power is mostly used for, like, Trickster or Huntress to, like, reload their powers quicker. That's primarily what that's used for. But technically, if you think that a survivor's in a locker and you want to check it to get that information, it helps you do it faster. So I guess it's technically tracking too, right? But I wouldn't say it's very good. I don't think people use it. I don't think anyone's using Iron Maiden because they're running around checking lockers and they want to do it quicker, right? Like, that's not the reason why anyone runs it. I will say, though, that a big use I see out of Iron Maiden is people use it with barbecue or even without barbecue, because I talked about earlier, like when I talked about barbecue earlier, I talked about how a lot of people will hop in lockers when they know barbecue is about to activate, right? When they know a killer's about to get a hook, they'll hop in a locker to avoid their aura being shown. And if they do that, then when they hop out, you'll see them with Iron Maiden, and they'll also become exposed. So it's kind of like a counter to barbecue's counter, right? It's like a counter to a counter. But even then, like, it's not that big of a deal, right? Like, you see generally where they are. Like, I think the information's cool. The expose doesn't really matter, but the information, I guess, is kind of cool. It's still not crazy good, right? It's still just kind of like okay at best. I don't know. If we're talking about purely tracking and nothing else, Iron Maiden does have some uses in, like, other areas. And again, I'll talk about it in the other tier list videos whenever I eventually get there. But if we're talking about purely tracking, it's got to be in either D or F. Is this worthy of D tier? Because, like, I feel like even then, like, the amount of people that jump into lockers to counter barbecue, it isn't that much. Like, I've run this perk before trying to, like, do that, where I basically was trying to, like, catch people off jumping in lockers for barbecue. And I've had a lot of games where just nobody does it the whole game. And I'm like, wow, Iron Maiden did nothing for me this game. So I think I'm going to put it in F tier for tracking. Like, this is for strictly tracking. Again, strictly for tracking, F tier. I think overall as a perk, it's a little bit higher up. It's not quite F tier. It's maybe like C or D tier overall as a perk. But if we're talking about solely tracking and that's it, F tier. Like, again, if you're looking at this perk, if you're looking at this tier list and you're like, hey, man, I want to find survivors. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, maybe at, like, lower MMR, where survivors are, like, more scared, maybe this actually could be good for finding survivors. You know what? I'm going to bump it up to D tier. You know, I changed my mind last second. I think there's a lot of factors that go into place, right? I guess I'm thinking about, like, sweaty games. But not every game's sweaty. Like, sometimes like, some people might play it in Elo where people hide a lot, right? And if you're playing in an Elo where people hide a lot, Iron Maiden might actually be kind of nuts, because they're going to be, like, in lockers and you'll be able to figure out where they are, on top of, like, the occasional barbecue value that you get sometimes. So yeah, I'm gonna put it in D tier. I changed my mind. It's gonna go in D tier. It's still not a good perk. It's still not a great perk for tracking. And again, if you're looking at this tier list looking for, like, good tracking perks, I wouldn't say it's amazing, but I wouldn't say it's quite F tier either. Like, it's not as bad as these ones. So yeah, D tier it is. Okay, next up is Lethal Pursuer. This one's really simple. It's just at the beginning of the match, when the match first starts, you see the auras of all 4 survivors for 9 seconds. And that's it. And then it's gone for the rest of the game. You get 9 seconds of aura reading, and then you're just a dead perk for the whole rest of the match. So this one's interesting because even though like I feel like maybe some people, depending on who you are and how much experience you have in this game, that might sound bad, right? For a lot of people, that might sound terrible. Like, oh god, 9 seconds of aura reading and that's it, and then it's gone forever. That's like nothing, right? Like, there's some people out there that might think that that's horrible, but it's really not, okay? Like, and I'll explain why. The beginning of the match is literally the single most important time of the entire game. I would say for both sides, but especially for Killer, right? Because it's the time when survivors are at their complete strongest. And the reason why they're at their strongest is because they're not under any pressure whatsoever, right? Like, putting pressure on the survivors is basically like getting hits, getting downs, or at least chasing survivors, right? That's how you put pressure. You basically force them off of gens by either A, forcing them to run away from you in fear of dying, or B, forcing them to have to save their teammates in fear of them dying, right? Like, you have to basically threaten them with death to get them off of generators, is essentially it. At the beginning of the match, though, there's really no threat. They spawn away from you, and if there's a gen anywhere near them, they're just going to go work on it, right? So all 4 of them, all 4 survivors are basically just free to just do gens at the beginning of the game. That is when they're the most efficient as far as getting gens done, because they all 4 can just hop on gens immediately and just get to work. You know what I mean? On top of that, it's also when the map has all of its resources, right? All the pallets are still there. All the breakable walls are still there. It's when the map has the absolute most amount of resources possible as well for the survivors to use. So even when someone does get found, the map is literally fresh and full and has everything. So the beginning, so the very beginning is really important, right? There's a very, very big difference in how a game goes, depending on, like, for instance, how long it takes you to find your first survivor. If you find your first survivor within 5 seconds of loading in, that is a lot different than taking like maybe 2 minutes to find your first survivor, right? They might get 2 gens done in that 2 minutes, and then, you know, almost half your objectives are gone by the time you find your first survivor. So again, that early game is really important. Like, it's very, very vital as Killer to like get something going in that early game, because if you don't, you're going to be losing more than you would during any other time of the match, because again, it's when survivors are at their strongest. There's no pressure. You need to start applying pressure as fast as you can. Otherwise, it's just going to start snowballing way out of control in their favor. So Lethal also has the additional benefit of what I talked about earlier. Again, I talked about it with Bitter Murmur. I talked about it with Retribution. It has the additional benefit of showing every survivor, right? So that's another reason why it's actually kind of solid. I'm going to go ahead and tier it right now while I continue talking about it, okay? I'm going to put it in B tier. So again, like, it has potential to be nuts, right? It kind of shows you where everyone is. It shows you where they spawned. And again, just using your own game sense and game knowledge, when you see where everyone is, you can kind of get a general idea of what they're going to do, right? Like, if you're good at the game, you kind of know what makes sense. You know, if there's a gen near them, you're like, okay, they're more than likely just going to go sit on that gen, right? Like, you kind of know like where people are going to be and like what they're going to do for the most part. So getting information on all 4 is huge. If you go straight to one survivor, if you manage to down them quickly, you already have a general idea of where the others are going to be, right? You can hook them, and then you'll know exactly what gen to go to, because you'll have seen where they spawned, right? Or maybe you'll know what direction the unhooker will come from, because you'll know generally where they are. So again, it really helps you get started in a really, really good way. It's honestly I'm tempted to put it A tier. I'm honestly tempted to put it A tier. Like, actually, let me think about this. Nurse's Calling, Barbecue, yeah, you know what, A tier. Like, now that I'm actually looking at these perks, it's better than Barbecue and Discordance for sure. It's probably about as good as Nurse's. It maybe even better than Nurse's, right? Again, the major downside of it is that it only lasts 9 seconds and it's gone forever, right? It's a dead perk after 9 seconds. But again, that 9 seconds is fucking huge. Like, the beginning of the game is big. It's a big part of the game. So like, even though it goes away after a little bit of time, you know, you have potential to go nuts with that. A very common thing that you'll see. I know there's a lot of like nursemains out there that were like going for like world record 4Ks for a while there, and this was a big perk that they ran. They almost always ran Lethal Pursuer, because if you ran like Lethal Pursuer plus range add-ons on Nurse, you can spawn in, immediately blink straight onto like someone's face and down them almost instantly if you're really good at Nurse, right? You'll just hit your blinks and then you'll also know generally where other people are, and you can just immediately start that snowball, right? Like we talked about Infectious Fright as far as snowballing, right? Now imagine that. Imagine if you combine lethal and infectious, right? And you're on a super strong killer like Nurse, bro. You're just gonna start going fucking crazy right off the bat. Like you're just gonna go ham. So again, I don't think it's as good as Infectious, just because Infectious lasts the whole way throughout the game. If Lethal Pursuer had maybe some kind of like if it had some kind of a lingering effect of some kind, then like maybe I can bump it up. But I think just the fact that it's there for 9 seconds and then it goes away forever, then you basically just have a dead perk slot. It gives insane value, but the value is not quite good enough to be S tier. I think it goes in A tier, but I'm pretty confident in its A tier placement. It's a very, very good perk. It's a very, very good perk. Again, strictly tracking perk too. Very, very good. Next up is Nemesis. Why is Nemesis in the... Oh, yeah, because you get aura reading, don't you? This one feels like... this one's going to go into honorary mention. I can already tell. Nemesis is a weird perk because it's like... It's basically it's like a perk that's designed to help you switch obsessions. Basically, if somebody stuns you in any way, whether it's like with a pallet or with like a decisive strike, they become the obsession. If they weren't already the obsession, they become the obsession. And when somebody becomes the obsession... While you have Nemesis, they become oblivious for 60 seconds. And also, you see their aura for 4 seconds. So that's kind of what happens, right? If someone becomes the obsession in any way, so it even works if they use like for the people, right? If they make themselves the obsession with like for the people or something, then it still works with that. But it also has the added benefit of if you get stunned, it switches obsession to whoever stunned you. So if someone becomes the obsession, and also if someone stuns you, they become the obsession, then you see their aura for 4 seconds, and they get oblivious for 60. Which is like, okay, so I feel like, again, like the tracking of this is the aura reading, and the aura reading really only matters when they're switching the obsession in some way that isn't stunning you, right? If a survivor stuns you, you don't really need tracking on them, right? 4 seconds worth of aura reading is not really worth it on someone that just stunned you. Like, fuck, by the time the stun animation's over, it's going to be down to like 2 seconds, and you already know where they are. They just stunned you. You don't need the information on them. They just stunned you. You obviously know where the hell they are. They just hit you with a pallet. You know what I mean? So, like, a lone Nemesis basically has no tracking whatsoever. The only reason why I think it's even in this list is because it's kind of like, I wouldn't say often, but there's like builds where you can combine it with things like Furtive Chase that makes it so that when you unhook the obsession, you become the obsession. So like in a build like that, like the person that unhooked, their aura gets revealed to you and they become oblivious. You know, you can combine it with things like Make Your Choice to kind of make like interesting builds where the aura reading actually does matter, at least a little bit. And like in that instance, right, like I guess the aura reading matters a little. But again, I feel like when you're looking at these perks, I think very few people that run Nemesis are going to run it for the aura reading, right? Most people that run this perk are doing it to like try to like manipulate the obsession in some way, right? For maybe like Myers add-ons or, you know, whatever. Maybe like to play with your food stacks or something. You know, it's usually about like obsession manipulation as opposed to the actual aura reading. I think the only build where the aura reading really comes into play is when you're doing like Furtive Chase, Make Your Choice. But honestly, that build's horrible, and that's mostly a meme anyway, so like it doesn't really matter. It's going on, I already mentioned. The aura reading is basically non-existent. It doesn't matter. No, I don't think anyone cares about the aura reading of Nemesis. That's not really the primary function. Again, blame my Twitch chat. Blame my Twitch chat. Next one up is No Way Out. This one's interesting because this is another one of those perks where like it might get kind of low in this tier list, but it's gonna be high in like the overall tier list. This perk makes it so that every single time you hook somebody for the first time, kind of like BBQ and Chili, you get a stack. So the stacks work the same way as BBQ and Chili. But what it does is, by default, it makes the exit gates blocked for 12 seconds whenever somebody goes to like work on them for the first time. But then you get an additional 12 seconds for every stack that you get throughout the game, up to a maximum of 4. So you can, if you get all 4 stacks, when a survivor first goes to work on an exit gate, it'll just block the exit gate in their face for 60 seconds. And on top of that, when they do that and the exit gate gets blocked in their face, you as a killer will get like a loud noise notification, kind of like a generator exploding at the exit gate that they did it at, which is where the tracking comes into place, right? So again, this perk is primarily slowdown. It's a very good slowdown perk. In an overall tier list, this would probably be up here somewhere. It's a very strong perk. Very, very strong. Would recommend as a perk. However, if we're talking solely about the tracking, it's kind of like D tier. It's okay, right? There's definitely scenarios in the endgame collapse where like knowing what gen or knowing what exit gate that they tried to do will come in really handy, right? I mean, any situation where there's like you know, where it's like a 1v1 and the doors are really far apart, it's god tier in that scenario, right? But there's a lot of scenarios in the end game where this will come in really handy, right? It just kind of gives you info on what execute they were trying to pressure, and it's not bad, right? It's not horrible. The end game collapse is a good time to get information like that, so like the timing of it's pretty good. But also, again, it's just not that crazy of a fact. It's just like, hey, they were trying to do this gate, and now it's blocked, so now you know someone's over there, right? It's just kind of like okay at best. It's honestly decently consistent, right? It's not even like a lot of these perks that are inconsistent. It's more consistent. It's just not that great. It's kind of like Hangman's trick in that way, right? Like both of these perks are like consistent in what they do. It's just that the effect they give you is just kind of like okay at best, right? As far as tracking, again, solely for tracking. Again, this is going to show up again in the slowdown tier list, and it's going to be tiered way higher, trust me. So solely for tracking, though, D tier is what it is. Oppression. This is another one. Another one. This perk makes it so that when you kick a gen, only when you kick a gen, by the way, the wording on it's weird because I think it says when you damage a gen, but it's only when you kick a gen, 3 other random gens on the map will also start regressing as well. And if anybody is actively working on those gens, they'll get hit with a very difficult skill check, and where if they fail it, you know, obviously it'll reveal their position because they failed a skill check. So this one's interesting because, again, it's mostly slowdown, and it's like barely tracking. The only tracking is there because of like them failing skill checks. Although I will say, having used this perk quite a few times, I actually like this perk a lot. I think this perk is a bit underrated. I think Pop Goes the Weasel Oppression is actually a pretty solid combination of perks that a lot of people kind of underestimate, maybe, I guess is the word I'm looking for. And you'd be surprised how many people do fail the skill checks. Even like good survivors, they get caught off guard, man. Because when you're working on a generator, you're expecting an easy skill check, right? Like I would say if you go work on a gen that's like regressing and you instantly get a skill check, it's pretty obvious that it's going to be an overcharge skill check. So you kind of know what to expect, which is why overcharge is like, you know, kind of bad because it's kind of easy to deal with the skill check. Or like decisive strike, you know, decisive strike gives you a hard skill check, but you know it's coming. Like, you know, you have it active, you know, you've been picked up, you know it's coming. With oppression, you're just kind of sitting there minding your own business, working on a gen like you always would be, and then the skill check sound plays just like it would if you got a regular skill check. So you're bracing for like a regular skill check, and then it ends up being this like really difficult DS style skill check, and you're like, oh fuck, what the hell? And you try to hit it, and then it's hard, right? Again, some survivors are going to be able to hit it anyway, because some survivors are just really good at that, right? They've been running DS for years, so they're just cracked at hitting hard skill checks. But you're definitely going to catch a lot of people off guard. And you'd be surprised how many even good survivor players will fail skill checks, and you'll figure out what gens they're working on. And that's really good info, right? Usually this happens when you're not actively in a chase, because, like, you know, usually you're kicking gens at a time where you're not like actively doing something crazy. So the information you get is actually not too bad. I think it's going to go in D tier though. A lot of perks are D tier, I'm coming to realize, because again, like, the information you get is decent, but it's not like god tier. It's also kind of inconsistent, right? It's good info. It's semi-consistent. And yeah, I mean, that's really it. It's good info and it's semi-consistent. Again, this is going to show up again on the slowdown tier list where it might rank higher. I'm not 100% sure. This perk is overall decent. It's not like super good or super bad. I would say it's like right around middle of the pack as far as an overall strength. But for tracking, D tier is what I think. Predator, straight to F tier. This perk is terrible. This perk basically takes the trail of scratch marks that survivors leave, and it tightens them up. So basically, normally when a survivor runs, they leave a wide trail of scratch marks behind them, like pretty wide, right? And this just makes that wide trail, instead of a wide trail, it makes it a very thin, direct trail. Now, you could make the argument that if you're playing on like an indoor map, this could be like a C tier perk, right? If you're playing on like Larry's, this could be a potential C tier perk, but only on indoor maps. Here's why. Because scratch marks don't show up over top of grass. And almost every map in the game has grass. I think the only maps in the game that don't have grass are the indoor maps, right? Like Midwich. Even Larry's has like little sections of grass, but obviously that doesn't really count. But like indoor maps like the game, Midwich, they don't have grass. On maps like those, this perk is actually pretty nuts, because when the survivors run away, there's literally just a straight line to them, right? Like we kind of talked about that with like with Bloodhound earlier, how blood trails are basically a straight line to the survivor. That's kind of what Predator makes scratch marks. It's like a straight line to the survivor. However, even though that sounds all good and fun on indoor maps, This map, or this perk literally hurts you on most maps. It literally is more harm than good, because what ends up happening is if survivors run through grass, you literally cannot tell where they went at all. When they're not running Predator, because the scratch marks are so wide, they kind of like paint like on the floor behind the survivor, but they also kind of paint on the walls too, right? Like if there's any like tree stumps, or if there's any objects just randomly sitting around the map, right? Like if there's trees, tree stumps, walls, the scratch marks will kind of paint up on the walls as well. So even if somebody runs through grass, you can usually look for like high up objects, and you can see scratch marks there, which can kind of let you know where the survivor went, right? Like the spread of the scratch marks actually benefits you because you can't see them on the ground, so you kind of look elsewhere and you can see them. But Predator removes that, right? So like for instance, if somebody runs away from you on swamp through like one of those sections of the map where there's just a ton of grass, good luck finding them, dude. It's practically like they have no scratch marks at all at that point. Like it's very rough. So again, this is one of the only perks in the game that I think has potential to literally do more harm than good. Like this literally feels like a survivor perk. Like it feels like if you run this on most maps, it's like a perk for survivors basically. Like you're basically benefiting them. It's crazy. It's a horrible bottom of F tier. I didn't think anything would go below Deathbound, but Predator going below Deathbound, it's really, really bad. Next up is Pain Resonance. This one might be kind of weird. You guys might be like, wait, why the hell is this in tracking? But you know, or you probably figured it out by now because we're counting, you know, blowing skill checks as or not blowing skill checks. Actually, this one isn't about blowing skill checks. They actually just scream. Okay, you know what? Ignore all that. This perk is Pain Resonance. This is a semi-new perk. Basically, it's a Scourge hook, which means 4 special hooks spawn around the map, and if you hook someone on one of those special hooks, basically whatever gen on the map has the most progress currently will explode. And if there's any survivors on that gen, they will scream, revealing their position. So it kind of tells you what gen has the most progress. Okay, first off, it regresses the gen with the most progress, which makes it a regression perk. So it's going to show up in the regression tier list as well. But it also gives you a lot of good info, right? It tells you what gen currently has the most progress, which is really good info to have, right? Because whatever gen has the most progress is usually where survivors are going to be hovering, you know? Survivors don't usually like for instance, if a survivor does like 70% of a generator, they're not just going to like walk away from it forever and be like, I got that, like, you know, like 3/4 of the way done, but whatever, I'll just leave. I'll let the killer regress it. It's fine. It's whatever. Like, no, if they committed that much time to doing that gen, it's like sunk cost fallacy, right? Like they have to finish it, dude. Like they're not just gonna let it sit. They're almost always gonna like hover near it, or like the second they get free time to do gens, they're gonna navigate their way back to it to try to finish it. Like figuring out what gen has the most progress is a lot more important than people might realize. Like that tells you a lot of information. Like it gives you a lot of info that actually comes in very, very useful. And on top of that, if there's a survivor on it, they scream, which again is even more info, right? It has potential of telling you that a survivor is there too. So because of that, believe it or not, it feels like it's such little info, right? Because again, we're only focusing on the tracking and not the regression. And it doesn't really feel like it's that much info, but that info is good, right? It's a small amount of info, but it's a very impactful amount of info. And I think because of that, I'm going to put it in B tier. I think it belongs right around the same level as these. It's good info. It's consistent info. It's not insanely like OP amounts of info, but it's very useful. It's consistently useful, right? Is what it is. Definitely better than these perks. Maybe not quite as good as these perks as far as pure tracking goes. Although you could maybe make an argument for this. You could make an argument for this, honestly. But that feels a little bit too aggressive to me. I think B tier sounds good. And also Scourge Hook, spoiler alert, is also, it's right up there with Deadman Switch as like one of the best perks in the game overall for killer, I think. If there was an overall tier list, these two would be at the top. These two also have insane synergy. They also have insane synergy with each other, but I think even alone, these two perks are insane, but they also have synergy. These two is like such an insane combo. I'm sure anybody that plays this game right now probably knows about this combo if you're like an active player, especially if you have a lot of hours. I'm sure you're probably sick of fucking seeing it too. It's a really good combo. Both these perks are very, very good. So just FYI. Again, you'll be seeing this in other tier lists as well, upcoming. But moving on, we got Spies from the Shadows. Spies is a perk where anytime someone pisses off a crow within, I think, 36 meters of you. Wow, 36 meters. I was right. Hell yeah. If someone pisses off a crow within 36 meters of you, you get a loud noise notification. And for some reason, it has a cooldown of 5 seconds. And I don't know why. I think that might just be to try to prevent it from like being too spammy and having like constant crow sounds or something. But basically, it's just like if anyone around you pisses off a crow, you'll get a little explosion, and then you'll see like it's kind of like, you know how I said earlier with Hoarder that there's like a special image that pops up that shows like someone opening a chest. That's kind of how Spies is. There's like you'll see an explosion, and when you look over, there'll be like the icon from Spies, like the crow, right? Like you'll see like the little crow picture of Spies. This perk is really not bad, but it's heavily dependent on the map. A lot of crow spawns are not in that good of areas anymore, unfortunately. Like a lot of crow spawns are like not okay, a lot of maps just don't even have that many crow spawns anymore. Some have a lot, some have very little, right? Like Asylum, like Crow-Dispen Asylum has a good bit of crows. On Crow-Dispen Asylum, this is actually a pretty solid perk. Even like Larry's has a surprising amount of crows for an indoor map. But the majority of maps don't have that many crows, and even the crows that are there aren't really positioned in places that are that important to the point where like it's going to be a big deal. So I'm kind of neutral about this. I'm a bit neutral. I'm going to put it in C tier. It consistently does get you at least some form of value, but it's just not enough, right? It's not a lot. On top of that, if you get good enough at paying attention to crows, you don't really need this if the crow is... If someone pisses off a crow in your line of sight anyway, you don't need this, right? This really only helps when someone does it like behind you where you can't see them. You know what I mean? Which again is still a thing. Like that still could happen. But you can like negate the use of this perk at basically like 180 degrees in front of you, because you can just pay attention, and if a crow flies, you can be like, oh hey, someone pissed off that crow, and you can go catch them, you know? So again, it's like, it's decent info if you're new to the game, right? Like I feel like this is like a, outside of Retribution, this feels like a, if you're new to the game, this could be good perk tier, right? Outside of Retribution, because that's kind of how I feel about this too. If you're new to the game, this could be solid. This could be okay. If you're struggling with tracking, if you're struggling with finding survivors, and you don't have any other perks to choose from because you probably don't have a lot of teachables yet, it's really not bad, right? It's not a horrible choice. It's really not. It's better than all of these perks, that's for sure. As far as pure tracking goes, it's better than these perks for pure tracking for sure, like by miles. Not as good as these ones though, but it's decent. So I think that's a pretty good spot for it. C tier is where it goes. Next up is Stridor. Stridor is a very hard one for me to judge because I don't really play with sound much. What Stridor does is it makes it so that injured survivors are louder, right? Like survivors that are injured, their like moans of pain are louder, but then also survivors that are like healthy, their breathing is louder. And I think that's the important one, is the breathing being louder. This perk used to be more popular because it used to counter Iron Will. There was a point in time where Iron Will is a perk that makes you silent when you're injured. There was a point in time where this countered Iron Will, where basically if a survivor ran Iron Will and you had Stridor, they would still make some grunts of pain, like very faint grunts of pain. But those days are gone, and now Iron Will hard counter Stridor. So it makes this perk a lot less valuable in that regard, right? Like as far as the injured sounds go, it's really not that valuable. Like injured survivors are already pretty loud, and them being louder is not that beneficial. They're already loud enough as is. It doesn't really matter that much, right? And again, if they have Iron Will, then they're silent anyway, so Stridor doesn't help there either. I think the main benefit of Stridor right now is the breathing sounds, because that's actually a really big deal. Again, it's hard for me to judge this, because if you guys have watched my channel often, you might realize that I spend pretty much every single game of Dead by Daylight consistently talking the entire time. If there's one thing that I'm really good at, it's never shutting the fuck up. I'm very, very good at that. And because of that, I'm not like really using sound to like its maximum potential, right? I'm not the type of player who's like really silently, intently listening while wandering around maps, listening for faint breathing sounds, right? I mean, that being said, even with me being as talkative as I am, sometimes there's like periods of silence where like I just finish a sentence and I hear breathing and I'm like, oh shit, I think that was a survivor breathing. And then I find somebody, right? Like it has happened before. I've heard breathing before. Like I know what it sounds like, and I have used it before in the past. I just don't use it often. It's not like a super common tactic for me. So this is hard to judge, really. I'm gonna put this in a tier based off what I think its potential is, which might be a stupid way to do this, but I really can't think of any other way to do it, right? Like I could put it in honorary mention for me just not knowing any better, but I think if you get really good with sound, like hypothetically, if you get really, really good with like sound in this game and you listen for breathing, see, okay, here's the thing that makes me unsure. I think like hearing survivors breathing is actually a huge like benefit, and if you can like learn to do that, that's huge, right? Like if you're looking around for a stealthy survivor and they're like behind a rock or something and you hear them breathe and you're like, oh hey, they're right behind that rock, like that's big. That is a big deal. I guess my thing is I don't know how much easier Stridor makes it compared to default, because again, it's not something I actively go for very often, so I don't know like how much louder it is. If it makes it a significant difference and makes it like significantly better to find people through breathing, then I think this perk belongs in about A tier. If the difference is not that much and you can basically do the same thing with Stridor as without Stridor, then I would say it's probably like, you know, obviously like D tier or F tier. So it's really hard to say. It has potential to be A tier, but again, I'm just not confident and I don't know. So you know what? Yeah, I'm going to put it in honorary mention then. This is weird because, again, this is solely a tracking perk. This is solely a tracking perk, and this category is kind of meant for like perks that like are kind of not really solely tracking perks. I just genuinely don't know how to rank this. I'm gonna be honest. I don't know how to do it. This is like the one perk in the game that I'm just not knowledgeable enough on, which is weird. I didn't think I would actually run into a perk like this. I kind of thought I would have enough knowledge about every perk in the game, but I guess this is actually one that I don't. So yeah, honorary mention. Although, like I said, if you just want to, like, for the sake of knowing where I think it goes, if it makes breathing sounds like significantly easier to hear, A tier. If it doesn't, F tier. So it's either A tier or F tier. That's how it's either A tier or F tier, depending on whichever way that goes. Okay, next up is Surveillance. This perk is basically a solely tracking perk. It makes it so that when you kick a gen, or actually when you damage a gen, it's not even when you kick it. When a gen is regressing is what it is. When a gen is regressing, it lights up as white, right? And then if somebody starts working on that gen and like basically stops the regression, it changes from white to yellow for like 8 seconds or so, for like 6 or 8 seconds or something like that. It basically turns yellow for a while, so you can know that somebody's on it. This is actually pretty okay. It's a pretty okay tracking perk. This is very often used in tandem. It's one of those perks where you almost have to use it in tandem with something else, though, right? Like running Surveillance completely on its own is not really going to be very good value the majority of the time, because you have to actively go around kicking gens, which is just a huge time investment that's very rarely worth it. But if you use it in combination with either something like Oppression, where you kick one gen and it regresses up to 4 gens at a time, or something like maybe like Hex Ruin, right? Or maybe something like Surge. Which again, like those perks aren't really gonna be coming into play in this tier list. But if you combine it with perks like that, it actually gets a lot of value, right? Because again, you find out what gens are being worked on because you can figure out which ones are regressing, right? Like for instance, especially like if I was just to give the example of with Oppression, right? If you have Oppression without Surveillance, you kick a gen and you have no idea what other gens have just started regressing, right? You know that, okay, this perk told me that up to 4 other gens, or is up to 3. Up to 3 or 4 other gens just started regressing, but I have no idea which ones. It's just somewhere around the map gens are regressing now, right? Whereas with Surveillance, it tells you exactly which ones, right? You can see them light up white, and you're like, oh, those are the gens that have progress on them. Those are the ones that were being worked on, so now I know, right? And on top of that, it also then gives you follow-up tracking, where if somebody then gets back on that to stop the regression, you instantly find out about it, which is, again, really good info. Like, if you're running a build with Surveillance in mind, this perk is actually really solid tracking. So with that in mind, am I going to be so bold as to put this perk? It kind of feels unfair because with Retribution, I feel like I gave Retribution a lot of slack because it needed to have perks that go along with it. And Surveillance is the same way, but I just feel like Surveillance, it's consistent, right? It's not a hex perk. It's more consistent. It lasts the entire time. I think that's kind of the difference maker here. It's not a hex perk. It lasts the entire time. It doesn't rely on survivors breaking totems. It's just always there when gens regress. I'm putting it in B tier. I'm doing it. I'm putting it in B tier. I think that's where it belongs. It's honestly solid. It's really, really solid. Strictly for tracking, pretty decent. Next up, Territorial Imperative. This is, I mean, this is pretty awful. This is a pretty awful perk. This perk makes it so that if you're more than 32 meters away from the basement, if a survivor starts to run down to the basement, then the perk will make a sound, and then also you'll see the aura of the survivor that's running down. It basically just tells you that someone's going to the basement if you're more than 32 meters away. This perk feels like it's either used for like taking advantage of somebody who's looting basement chests, which again, like I talked about this when I talked about Hoarder, dude. Like, man, leave them alone, dude. The poor looters, like they're just minding their own business. They're not like slamming gens. They're not being sweaty tryhards. They're just trying to loot. Let the looters loot. Like, come on, bruh. But anyway, outside of that though, I mean, at the end of the day, like basement's a strong area, and if you can catch somebody out in the basement, that is a very strong thing to happen. But the fact that you have to be kind of far away means you have to run over there, right? So it can be kind of good for maybe like camping basement from further away, right? Because it gives you a notification when they start going down, not when they make it down. It gives you a notification when they're like maybe like 3 steps down the basement stairs, and those basement stairs have like 30 steps. So it's like a 10th of the way down the stairs. It gives you the notification. So for instance, if you have a survivor hooked in the basement and you like walk away, like you walk like 40 meters away, you'll get a notification when the unhooker first starts going down. So you'll have like a good like maybe 4 or 5 second head start to turn around and start coming back to the basement before the unhook actually happens, which then puts you in a better spot to like take advantage of it, right? So with all that in mind, you know, I guess I'll put it in D tier. Bro, there's so many perks in D tier. I'm feeling bad about all the D tier perks, but I just think there are a lot of perks that are around this level of strength. I mean, I don't know. I feel bad, but I also stick to it. I mean, I can't help the behavior makes a lot of, you know, less like below average kind of mediocre fucking perks, you know? Not my fault. Not my fucking fault. I'm just over here analyzing, you know? I'm not developing. So, like, again, there's situations where it can come in really useful. There's situations where it can come in very, very handy, and it could even potentially clutch wins. There's also a really disgusting build that you can run with this, with Demogorgon, and make your choice. And I'm not going to talk any more about it. If you know what I'm talking about, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I don't really want you to know, because it's fucking gross. It's a really gross build, and nobody should run it. But there is potential. This perk has potential. It's definitely not amazing, but it has potential. It has more potential than these perks, I think, anyway. As far as tracking goes, anyway. And yeah, I think that's right. Moving along to Thrilling Tremors. This is kind of one of those like duo perks where it does 2 in 1. This perk makes it so that when you pick up a survivor from the downstate, like when you pick them up and you're getting ready to carry them to the hook, any gen that isn't currently being worked on gets blocked for 14 seconds. And again, if you remember from all these other perks, when a gen gets blocked, the aura changes to white. Like you can see that a gen is blocked, right? So that sounds like slowdown, right? Obviously, it's like, well, you know, you're blocking gens, so clearly that's slowdown. And yeah, it is slowdown, but it's also tracking, because the gens that don't get blocked are the ones that are being worked on. So for instance, if you pick someone up with Thrilling Tremors and then you look around and every gen is white except for one gen, then you know that that gen is being worked on by survivors and that you should go over there after you're done with the hook. To me, it's kind of like a weird mix of like barbecue and Dead Man Switch, right? Like it's kind of there to like tell you where to go after getting a hook, but it feels like a little bit more consistent than barbecue. And it feels kind of similar to Dead Man Switch in the sense that it relies on them being on a gen, right? Like barbecue can work on people that aren't even on gens, whereas like both Dead Man Switch and Thrilling Tremors requires them to be on a gen to really get the info. But again, good survivors are probably going to be sitting on gens. If the survivor players aren't sitting on gens, then it sounds like you're probably going to have an easy game anyway, so who really fucking cares, right? Like, do you really need the tracking if they're not sitting on gens? It doesn't matter. You probably have a free win. What the hell are they doing? Like, why are they not doing their objective? You know what I mean? So I actually think the information this gives you is really good. I think it's literally just barbecue, but better in terms of tracking. So with that in mind, I put barbecue in B tier. That means that I basically have to put this in A tier, which I think does fit. I think it's very good tracking. I think it's maybe, aside from Dead Man Switch, it might be the best perk in the game as far as knowing where to go after a hook, right? Like after you hook somebody, if you're like not sure where to go, this is probably your best bet. Dead Man Switch or Thrilling Tremors is probably your best bet. But Thrilling Tremors is definitely very, very good in that regard. And it's very consistent and it's very solid. And again, it also gives additional slowdown as well. So it's a very solid perk. I think if Barbecue and Chili didn't give you the extra blood points that it does, you would be seeing Thrilling Tremors a lot more. Like a lot more. So yeah, I don't know. A tier, pretty solid tracking. Pretty good. Next up is Tinker, good old Tinky Winky. This is the other perk. Man, this was so much earlier in the video that I talked about this, but this is the other perk that I was talking about when I was talking about Discordance earlier, where I think I think Odds talked this perk up a lot and everyone started loving it, but I think it's overrated. I think this perk is super overrated. I don't think it's actually that good at all. Here's what it does. Basically, when a gen is close to being completed, I think it's when it's like 70% completed, you get a noise notification. You get like an explosion sound and you get a noise notification on that gen, so you kind of like know what gen's almost done. And then also you get undetectable for, I believe it's 16 seconds. Damn, I'm proud of myself. Both of those numbers were right. 70% and 16 seconds. Yep, both those numbers were right. I'm proud of myself. So it's interesting because it's like, it tells you when a gen is almost done and it gives you stealth so that you can then possibly go over there. So the stealth is not really a part of the tracking. That's obviously like, that's going to be utility. So you will be seeing this in the utility tier list as well. But as far as just the tracking goes, I think this perk is actually better for tracking than it is the utility. Like, I think the notification of the gen is actually the more important thing rather than the undetectable, in my opinion. Because again, we did talk about that earlier. Like, that was a big reason why Scourge Hook was so high up, was because you find out what gen has the most progress, right? The main difference here, though, and again, I think people might get mad at me for where I tier this, but I'm just gonna spoil. I'm spoiler. I'm gonna put it in C tier. The main difference here, again, because I know it's similar, right? I know I talked about Scourge Hook earlier. I was like, Scourge Hook tells you what gen is almost done, and you know that that's where survivors are going to hover because they're going to want to get it done, right? The main difference is with Tinkerer, like, Scourge Hook regresses that gen by 15%, which is a decent chunk, right? Tinkerer does not regress it. It just kind of tells you where it is, right? And also, on top of that, Scourge Hook works after you get a hook. So you literally just got done hooking a survivor, which means you more than likely have like no real like thing that you're currently doing, right? Unless maybe you downed multiple people at the same time or something, right? And you have like a bunch of slugs around you. More than likely, after you're done hooking a survivor, you're like not actively doing anything. You're not actively chasing anybody. You're like looking for a chase, right? You're looking for somewhere to go. So when you know a gen's almost done, it makes sense to go there. With Tinkerer, it's kind of different. Tinkerer doesn't activate after a hook. Tinkerer just activates randomly. Well, not randomly. It activates when the survivors basically decide it activates, right? So you can be like in the middle of a chase, right? Like you could have been chasing a guy for like, you know, like a minute and a half, and you finally got him to a good area, right? Where you're going to get the down within the next like 15 seconds, and then Tinkerer pops. And then it's like, shit, what do you do? Like, do you try to go defend the generator that just got popped with Tinkerer? Or do you just commit to the chase and down the person, right? And in that case, it honestly is better to commit to the chase and down the person, right? Like, a lot of people make the mistake with Tinker. A big thing I noticed when Tinker became popular is a lot of killer players made the other decision. They would do the latter, where they would leave the chase every single time that Tinker procced. Any single time this perk procced, they would just leave the chase and try to go defend the gen. But that is not a good way to use this perk. As a matter of fact, that's another thing about this perk that kind of worries me. I think it kind of baits new killer players into making bad decisions. Like, a lot of these perks are perks that I would recommend running as a new killer, right? If you're a new killer player, I would recommend running Bloodhound. I would recommend, like, Spies. Like, a lot of these perks are good for a new killer player. They can kind of get you into some good habits. Tinker, on the other hand, I think would get a new killer player into bad habits. I don't like it as a perk. I think it'll get you into the habit of, like, leaving chases to just, like, go chase people off of gens, which is not an efficient way to play killer at all. Again, having the information of what gen is almost completed, though, is useful. There's a lot of times where it is useful, right? And again, we talked about it with Scourge Hook. Like, if you're not in a situation where, like, you know, walking away is a super big misplay, and you can go to the gen that's almost done and like kind of like play around it, then yeah, it's nice. It honestly can be nice. It has potential to be pretty decent. It's just not consistently decent, right? There's a lot of games that I use Tinker where there's not really any value whatsoever, right? Like, it's just not really that good. So I don't know. I think C tier is where it goes. I don't think it's as good as these things as these perks for tracking. It's okay, right? It tells you when a gen's about to be done, and that's really it. And it's like, okay, cool, you know. And then now what? So I think C tier is where it goes. I don't think it's that good. I might get hate for that. If you guys want to hate me for it, feel free. But it's not that good. Okay, Trail of Torment. I can already tell this one's gonna go on honorary mention. This is, again, blame my Twitch chat. Because this is a perk where when you kick a gen, you get undetectable for as long as that gen is regressing, and the gen aura turns yellow for the survivors, right? And you have undetectable until either A, you down a survivor, or B, you one of the survivors stops the gen from regressing by tapping it, right? So again, technically, if you kick a gen with Trail of Torment, you have undetectable, and then if your undetectable randomly goes away without you downing somebody, then you know for a fact that somebody got back on that gen that you kicked, right? So like, it's kind of like a shittier budget surveillance in that way or something, I guess, right? But again, I don't think anyone's picking Trail of Torment with that in mind. I don't think anybody is picking Trail of Torment as a perk to be like, yeah, I want to track survivors. Like, I want to kick a gen and then know when someone works on that gen again, right? Like, if someone wanted to do that, they would pick surveillance, because that's literally what surveillance does. But it's also like, it doesn't have like a cooldown, because Trail of Torment also has a cooldown, right? So like, again, it's not a tracking perk. It's just not. It's not a tracking perk. It doesn't. I don't think it belongs in this tier list. It technically does have tracking, so it did get included in the list, but I'm not really putting it in a tier. It's going out in honorary mention. Next up is Unnerving. This is another one where like I was kind of skeptical when putting in tracking, because it might not seem like a tracking perk at first, but again, this perk, kind of like some of the other ones around here, kind of like Lullaby, kind of like Overcharge, it's kind of designed to make you fail skill checks, right? That's kind of the idea. What this perk does is it makes it so that when you're in the killer's terror radius, the skill checks that you get are smaller. They're not quite like Decisive Strike level small, but they're like they're like significantly smaller than normal, and you also get more skill checks. So yeah, I mean, it's basically there to try to get you to fail skill checks. You get more of them, and they're harder to hit, right? But again, it doesn't make them that small, and it really only works against like bad survivors. And like, I'm talking real bad survivors. They're really not that hard to hit at all. Like, any decent survivor player is going to be able to hit Unnerving Presence skill checks. Again, you mostly see this ran with things like Overcharge to kind of get the full combo going of like, you know, them getting a skill check and also it being small and so on and so forth. But again, at the end of the day, if you're just looking for tracking, again, you can make an entire build based around like Unnerving, Overcharge and stuff, but even that's not a good build, right? That would be a fucking F tier build anyway. So like, yeah, it's F tier. It's not actually that good. I mean, whether it should go in honorary mention or not, I don't know, because I do feel like that's like pretty much the whole purpose of this perk, right? Like, if the whole point of the perk is to get you to fail skill checks, then I think that makes it a 50-50 tracking perk as well as regression perk. Which again, it's going to be low in both. It's not a good perk at all. So F tier it goes. Next up is Whispers. This is my favorite tracking perk in the whole game. It's going to the top of S tier. I love Whispers. I fucking love this perk. This is such a good tracking perk. This is a criminally underrated tracking perk by a criminally underrated tracking perk to a lot of people. And I heavily urge you, if you're watching this video and you're like, what the fuck is this guy talking about putting Whispers in S tier, right? Like, if that's your thought process when you see this tier list, please watch my Whispers guide video that I made. Is one of the oldest videos I made. It was like one of the first videos I uploaded to this channel. It was when I first got into like making guides, and the information in it is still really good, right? This perk has like never been changed since release. It's always been the same since 2016 because it's a fucking god tier perk. It's a god tier, very well designed perk, and this perk literally has its own skill gap. You can be good with Whispers and bad with Whispers, and that's a big reason why a lot of people don't give it the credit it deserves. Because in order to get good value out of Whispers, you have to actively be good at using it. And there's not very many perks in the game that are like that, right? Like, most perks, you just slap them on and it does its job. Like Scourge Hook, you just slap it on, you get regression, and you get, like, you know, the explosion of the gen. Like Barbecue, you slap it on, you see the auras, right? Like, you throwing Tremors, you slap it on, the gens get, or the gens get blocked, except for the ones that are being worked on. Like, most perks, you just kind of slap them on, and then the value just kind of is obvious. It's just there, you know? With Whispers, you have to really know how to use it, right? Like, you have to know what to do. So, okay, wait, I didn't even explain what this perk does. I've been over here fucking simping hard for this perk, but I haven't even explained what it does yet. Oopsie. Basically, what this perk does is it just makes it so that if anybody is within 32 meters of you, the perk lights up on the little overlay of your perks. It lights up and becomes like bright. And also, you hear like a groan of Whispers in your ear, but it's very faint. You hear like a blah, 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 blah in your ear, right? So that's all it does. Very simple. That's all. If a survivor is within 32 meters of you, it lights up, you hear a groan of pain. If they're within 32 meters of you and they're alive, right? It works if they're on a hook, it works if they're in a locker, it works if they're downed. As long as they're not dead, then Whispers will activate if they're within 32 meters of you. So, again, at first hearing that, it might not sound very good. You might be like, okay, it tells you if there's somebody in your general area, right? Like, who cares? But what you might not realize is, if you get good at knowing how far 32 meters is, this plays a big, like, role, right? And again, please, it'll be linked down below. My Whispers got to be linked down below. Feel free to check it out to get more and more details about it. But what you can do is you can basically pay attention to when it clicks on, right? And the second it clicks on, you know for a fact that there is a survivor in a 32-meter radius of you, right? So if you're good at judging how far 32 meters away is, then you'll know exactly like a little semicircle in front of you of where to look for the survivor. Like you'll know exactly that they're in a certain semicircle, which can really, really, really help you like pinpoint where people are. On top of that, okay, and that goes in, and there's even more that goes into that. Like you can literally use it to like triangulate someone's position. Again, watch the video if you guys want to learn more about it. But not only that, it also helps you know where people aren't. That's a big part about this perk that people don't realize. Not only does it tell you where people are, it tells you where people aren't, right? For instance, I'll just play out a scenario and I'll play out a hypothetical scenario, right? Say you're like running around and you're looking for survivors and you don't know where to look, right? And you're not sure where to look. You're not sure where to find them. Like you're struggling to find a chase, right? You come up to a gen and it's got like 40% progress on it, right? Like it's been worked on. And you're like, oh, someone's worked on this gen. They're probably nearby, right? Now, with Whispers and without Whispers, there's a big difference here. If you have Whispers on, you can know for a fact if they're nearby, right? Because Whispers will be lit up. If Whispers is lit up, you're like, oh, someone was working on this and they're still here. Like, I can look around for them. But if you go there and Whispers is off, then you can go, oh, this gen was being worked on, but Whispers is off. There's very clearly no one around. I can just simply leave because I know not to waste my time. And that might not seem like a big deal, but if you're unsure, right? Like if you don't know, if you're like, oh man, maybe there's someone here, maybe there's not. If you take like 20, 30 seconds to like look around for that person, that's a huge time investment, dude. 20 to 30 seconds. I mean, generators only take 80 seconds to get done, right? And there's 4 survivors. That's potential for like an entire gen to get done while you're just like looking around for a survivor that you don't know is there or not, right? So like, that's the good thing about Whispers is it just helps you be efficient at all times. You can use it to pinpoint survivors if you get good enough with it. And also, it just helps you stay time efficient at all times. It tells you where people are. It tells you where they aren't. And it's just, it's so good at like keeping you on your game. Not only that, I would make the argument that in the early game, Whispers is kind of like Lethal Pursuer, but better. Sorry, not better. It's not better in the early game. I would say overall it's like Lethal Pursuers, but better, but not in the early game. Like Lethal Pursuer is obviously better in the early game, but Whispers kind of does similar things to Lethal Pursuer in the sense that if you're a player that has really, really good game sense and you also are running Whispers, you can find your first chase almost instantly every single time. I guarantee it. A good killer player with Whispers will find a survivor super quick every single time. Now, obviously, with Lethal Pursuer, you know where all 4 of them are, and you also see where they are, and you see where they're going. We talked about this earlier. So I'm not saying that it's a better early game perk than Lethal Pursuer. If we're talking about solely the early game, Lethal Pursuer is better than Whispers. But the thing about Whispers is that it continues to give you value throughout the game. It never stops giving you value. It gives you really good value from start to finish. And speaking of finish, it's probably also the very best perk you can have in the end game, right? I was talking about No Way Out earlier being a really good perk in like the end game scenario as far as tracking goes. Whispers is even better. Like good luck ever like losing an exit gate standoff when you have Whispers, right? You just keep going back and forth to the gates until eventually Whispers quick turns on, and then you're like, oh, well, he's near this gate, so now I know not to leave, right? Like it's impossible to lose if you have that. It's insane. It's such a good tracking perk. Again, if you've not seen the video I made on it, please check it out. Criminally underrated perk. It's so good. I think it's the best tracking perk in the game. It's also my favorite tracking perk in the game, so maybe I'm a bit biased, but I'm sticking to it, man. I think it's the best tracking perk in the game. I will say it. I think it's right up there with Infectious and Deadman Switch. Okay, last but not least, we got Rancor. Rancor is an interesting perk because Rancor, I feel like, is a perk that a lot of people might just view as an endgame perk because this perk kind of does 2 different things. There's like one effect that makes it so that when you get to the end game, like when you get the end game collapse, or is it when all the gens are done? Yeah, actually, it's actually when all the gens are done. It's kind of similar to Noed. It's when all the gens are done. When all the gens are done, basically the obsession just becomes permanently exposed, and you also get the ability to moor them. So they're one-shot downable, and if you manage to down them, you can just kill them on the spot. Doesn't matter how many times they've been hooked. So it's like a big old middle finger fuck you to the obsession in the end game is essentially what it is. But also, like, I think that's what most people remember this perk for, but also it has an additional benefit where throughout the match, when a generator finishes, you can see the locations of every survivor. It's like a scream. It's kind of like a scream, except they don't actually scream. So it's kind of weird. But you get like the bubble like you would get when a survivor screams, like that little bubble that pops up. You get that on every survivor, every single survivor. You get that. On the inverse side, also the obsession actually sees your aura for 3 seconds as well. So it's kind of like a double-edged sword, right? Like you see them, but they also see you for a short amount of time. So, you know, there's kind of like a weird downfall to it too. But again, you see where everybody is, all 4 survivors. And again, we've talked about this multiple times throughout this video. If at any point you know where all 4 survivors is, that's really good information, right? Like that has potential to be very, very important information. So again, it happens like throughout the match multiple times, and getting that information is pretty solid. I don't think it's like amazing, right? Again, it's kind of got the same problem as Tinker, where like you can't really decide when it happens, right? It just kind of happens randomly, like whenever a gen gets done. Like you can't really control when that happens, right? It might happen at a terrible time, it might happen at a great time. There's really no way to know. But the information you get is really good. Like the locations of every single survivor is a very, very good chunk of information. Like that is very, very good. So because of that, it's going to B tier. I think B tier is where it goes. I think it's not quite as good as A tier, but I think it's definitely better than the C tier perks as far as tracking goes. It's honestly a lot more solid in terms of tracking than I think a lot of people give it credit for. Like it's actually pretty fucking good. And that's it. That's the tier list. Okay, literally as I was going to put this video out, the ring chapter came on the PTB. So this is editing tofu. Hello. This is me editing the video later. I'm going to, in a very, very scuffed way, I'm going to add in the ring chapter perks and rank them where I think they belong, because I think I'm going to be adding them into every other tier list as well. So I might as well just do it, I guess. I think all 3 of the new perks could be considered tracking perks in some way. I mean, based on our very loose definitions we've had in this video so far, I feel like we can consider them tracking in at least some way. So I'm going to start with the weakest and go to the strongest in terms of the new perks. I'm going to quickly say what they do and then put them in the tier list where I think they belong. Okay, starting out with Merciless Storm. This is a perk that's getting added where when a generator reaches 90% progress, survivors working on the gens get a series of continuous skill checks. This is very similar to the yellow glyphs that are in the archives, where you kind of get like a circle that goes around and then just there's like constant skill checks that just pop up that you have to continuously hit. And if the survivor either stops repairing or if they miss one of the skill checks, then the gen gets blocked for 20 seconds. It also can only trigger once per gen per trial, so you can't really like take advantage of this with like Pop Goes Louisa and stuff and like regress it and then try to have it activate again. It's once per gen, which is actually really important. So in my opinion, if we're talking about pure tracking with this perk, again, this perk seems more like a slowdown perk than anything, because you get the gen to be blocked if they, you know, mess up or if you can chase them off of it. It feels more like a slowdown perk than anything else, but obviously if they fail the skill check and, you know, like maybe if you don't even like know that they were on the gen, but then they fail the skill check, you can randomly see a gen get blocked across the map and you're like, oh, hey, that gen must have been over 90% completed, you know? So there is some tracking aspect there, although it solely relies on the survivors messing up, right? If you chase the survivor off that gen and force it to block that way, that's not really tracking. That's more like you taking advantage of you already knowing that they're there. So that's not really tracking. I think the tracking would be if they mess up on their own volition. And I think relying on survivors to mess up in order to give you tracking is, again, just really, really bad. So this one's going to go to the F tier for tracking. So as you can see, like I said, I wasn't joking. This shit's going to be really scuffed. It doesn't really fit with the image at all, but you know what? It's whatever. We're doing it anyway. I can't really think of a better way to do this, so this is how we're doing it. Moving right along, we got the next perk that I think is the next best, but is still kind of bad. And that would be Call of Brine. Now, I said kind of bad, but I should have said kind of bad in terms of tracking. This perk is actually, I think, really good overall. It's just not a very great tracking perk in particular. So what it actually does is basically after you kick a generator, this gen becomes active for 60 seconds, and that gen regresses at 200% the normal regression speed, and the aura is revealed to you. So it's like ruin level regression. It goes twice as fast. And each time a survivor completes a good skill check on that generator, you get a loud noise notification. So again, this is more of a regression perk than anything else. It like slows down gens, it regresses progress, but there is a bit of tracking here, right? There is a little bit of tracking because you do get a noise notification when someone does a skill check on the gen that you kick. So you can kind of kick a gen that has a lot of progress, and then if a survivor jumps on it, there's a pretty good chance that you're going to know that they're on it. So it's almost like, I don't know, you can almost look at it as like single target surveillance. In a way, I honestly think the tracking on this is really not that bad, because I think a lot of the times they use this perk, it's going to be on a generator that has a lot of progress, and you're really going to be wanting to keep track of it very closely, so it's going to help a lot with that. I'm still a bit torn, though, because you have to go out of your way to kick the Gen 2, which is a big investment, and you can't always really be doing that mid-match. I really don't know where to put this. I think I'm going to put it in C tier, although I think it's perfectly reasonable that this could go into B tier or maybe even A tier, depending on how well it gets played. But I think more realistically, I think, especially because of how RNG skill checks are, if it wasn't skill checks and if it was something else, then maybe it would be higher. But skill checks are just so RNG. Again, like we talked about this with previous perks. So I think just with the RNG aspect, I think C tier is probably where it belongs. Okay, and lastly, in my opinion, the best perk as far as tracking goes in this PTB chapter is the new Scourge hook. It's called Scourge Hook Floods of Rage. What this perk does is it makes it so that if a survivor is unhooked from a Scourge hook, all other survivors except for the person that's unhooked have their auras revealed for 7 seconds. Pretty simple, but also pretty fucking solid. So again, many times in this video, we have discussed how strong it is to have the ability to know where every single survivor is, right? It's a big part of being able to make good decisions as killer, is being able to identify where every single survivor on the map is. And this provides that, right? Because the only aura that you don't see is the person being unhooked, but obviously you know that person just got off the hook, so you know where they are, right? So being able to see where everyone is actually a huge deal. And especially considering the fact that there's so many other good Scourge hook perks out there that it's really not that crazy to try to like heavily invest in getting to your Scourge hook anyway. So this is actually a really solid perk. I honestly think this has potential to be really strong. There's so much synergy potential with other perks too, like Make Your Choice and other things where you can get insane value out of it. It's honestly, I think, a very top tier tracking perk. This one is without a doubt to me going into the A tier. Honestly, I think the only thing that's keeping it from going into the S tier might be the fact that it's only Scourge hooks, right? Like sometimes you get really unfortunate Scourge hook spawns and sometimes you can't always make it to one. So you know, there has like a minor reliability issue. It's not super common, but it's at least something that's there. And I just don't quite think it's good enough to be considered A or S tier, but I think it's very strong for sure. Okay, I'm going to go right back to the ending that I already recorded. A little bit of spoilers. You can tell that I put it in A tier a little bit off to the side because something else is going to be moving into A tier. Big shocker. So anyway, back to the ending. Sorry how scuffed this was. Let's just go on and end the video as normal. I can maybe take a look and see if I want to adjust anything last minute, but honestly, I'm feeling pretty good about it. Like the only one that I was a bit skeptical about was Dead Man Switch, but honestly, I'm cool with Dead Man Switch staying in S tier. I do think that the information you get from Dead Man Switch is honestly really insane after you hook somebody. Like it's honestly fucking nuts. You know what? Actually, the more I think about it, like, no, I'm gonna put it in A tier. I know, bro. I know. I'm annoying. I annoy myself, okay? But when I'm really looking at it, like, dude, Infectious and Whispers are fucking god tier tracking perks, man. Like, these are so good. So good. And these perks are like, they're very good, but there's like, you know, like little instances where maybe you won't get value, right? And Dead Man Switch is the same way. Like there are definitely times where like maybe you'll hook somebody and, you know, people that are working on gens will just full commit and they'll never let go and you won't even know, you'll never get the information out of them, right? It's not like these perks are like consistently insanely good value, right? These perks give you consistent, very good value at very good times. Whereas like this is like, very good information at like it's just not it's just a minor lack of consistency. So I'm gonna knock it down to A tier, but I still think it's really good. But I'm gonna put it A tier instead of S is all. And yeah, this is I think this looks good. I think this is about my tracking tier list. Hope you guys enjoyed this. Hope you guys learned a thing or two. Let me guys know your thoughts on this. Let me guys know your thoughts on this format as far as tier lists go. I think it's kind of an interesting way to do it. I wanted to do a perk tier list, but I didn't really want to do like a fucking 10-hour video where I go through every single one. So this feels like an interesting way to do it. If you guys like this, I'll go ahead with the next ones and I'll do lethality, slowdown, as well as utility, and I'll go into all those as well and do the same thing. Again, a reminder that even if a perk is low in this tier list, this is solely only about the tracking aspect of the perk, right? A lot of these perks that are low in this tier list, like are actually pretty solid perks. They're just not good tracking perks, if that makes sense. Like their tracking is not insanely good. It's just that their other effects are good. So yeah, anyway, let me know what you guys think about it. If you guys disagree with my placements of some of the perks, let me know. Let me know, dude. Comment it. Let me know. Give me that sweet algorithm value, baby. But honestly, if anyone gives, like, if you guys want to give me like real good thoughts, I feel like every time I make a video like this, like half the comments are like, oh my god, this fucking guy is so stupid, and he thinks that this perk is good, and he thinks that this perk is bad. Wow, this guy's so stupid. Why does anyone watch him? And like, obviously that's annoying, but like, hey dude, free algorithm, right? You know, hey, you're actually benefiting me with the algorithm, baby. But the other half of people, there's actually a good chunk of people that give me like well thought out, like good constructed thoughts as far as like why they think a perk might belong in a tier that's not. And I love that, right? I don't get a chance to respond to it all, but I do read almost all of it. I want you guys to know that. It's kind of overwhelming, the idea of trying to respond to every single comment when there's so many, but I do at least read almost all of them, and a lot of you guys bring up really, really good points. And I've had my mind changed about a lot of things through my comment section, believe it or not. So if you guys feel strongly about something, let me know. I really am curious to hear your thoughts. If you guys like the video, feel free to like it. It helps me a lot with the algorithm, gets more people into my videos and stuff, which is always a good thing, you know, for me. Subscribe as well if you guys like the content. I'll be having more like this coming your way. And also stop by my live stream. I'm live on Twitch six nights a week over at twitch.tv/OhTofu, and you guys can feel free to stop by, say hello, hang out, have a good time with me. And yeah, hope you guys have an awesome rest of your nights. I'm out of here, and until next time, I will see you guys. I'll see ya. I'll take care. See ya. See you later. See ya.